Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Wong Tam, City Councillor representing Toronto Centre. I'm also the chair of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer and Two-Spirit Advisory Committee. It's great to be here with all of you. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the third meeting of the committee. The committee secretary has confirmed that we do have quorum, so I will call the meeting to order. Welcome back, everyone. This meeting is being used and hosted by the City of Toronto's WebEx technology with members and staff connected by video conferencing or calling in. Because we are meeting remotely, we ask for your patience with any delays and technical issues. Members of the public can watch the meeting streaming live on YouTube at youtube.com/Toronto City Council Live. We do not have any registered public speakers today. I would like to request that city staff keep your microphones muted and your video turned off unless you need to address the committee. This will make it easier for myself as chair to see the members as we debate and vote on the agenda items. Members, please keep your microphones on mute unless you have questions for staff or wish to speak to an item. If members wish to speak to an item or ask questions of staff, please make sure your video is on, raise your hand physically if you can, or unmute your microphone and indicate your intention to speak. I will create a speakers list to keep us in an orderly fashion. Please note that certain interactive features of WebEx, such as raise hand, are disabled. The chat feature has also been disabled as a communication tool for meeting participants and may be used for technical troubleshooting only. Any chats you type will go into the technical support staff who are supporting this meeting. When voting on an item or a motion, I would ask members to turn on the video and raise your hand to indicate your vote. If there is a recorded vote, you'll be asked to state if you are in favor or opposed. Members, I want to remind you that we're meeting remotely today and that we must submit our motions in writing. The clerk staff are here and available to support you. You can email them at lgbtq2s@toronto.ca. They will provide you with some support in writing the motions. Although we are meeting in different locations and meeting remotely today, the LGBTQ2S Advisory Committee acknowledges the land that we're meeting on is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I will now ask for any declarations of interest. Seeing none, are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? If you'd like to declare an interest, please indicate the item number and the nature of your interest. Asking again. Seeing none, thank you very much. I now need to move a motion to confirm the minutes from our last committee meeting on June 22nd, 2021. Preferably someone who is in attendance of that meeting. Okay. Susan, thank you very much. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. We are now heading to the agenda. I'm going to review the order paper. There are 7 items on today's agenda meeting. The first is the chair's report. The chair's report has been updated. For those who can, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, we did make one additional change to the chair's report, and that was largely because of the executive committee meeting last week where they adopted the recommendation to our name change. It will then proceed to City Council, but that's primarily the only change from the chair's report. It was submitted earlier today. Are there any questions of the chair's report? Seeing none, I will move to receive the chair's report. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you very much. Item number 2 is QS 3.2 Work Plan Development. We will have a presentation from Janice Alvarez, who is the Acting Manager of Equity Unit People and Equity, to speak to the item. I'm going to just quickly go through the order paper and then we're going to come back to Janice. So we'll hold that item for the presentation. Item number 3 is Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy. We'll be holding that item because we have a presentation from staff. Wayne Chu will be here with us. Item number 4 is supporting two-spirited lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youth in accessing safe, affordable, and supportive housing. We'll hold that item for staff presentation. Excuse me. Item number 5, supporting two-spirited lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer youth in Toronto's shelter and overnight service system. We will hold that matter. We have a presentation from staff. Item number 6 is digital infrastructure plan, equity, bias, and discrimination considerations. That item will be held because we have a staff presentation. And then finally, item number 7, this is a new presentation that was submitted. You hopefully will have seen it online now. We will be receiving a presentation from staff led by Lana Bird. So that brings us back to item number 2, work plan development. Let's welcome Janice Alvarez to the floor. And Janice, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chair. I am here today just to update the committee. So at the June 22nd, 2021 meeting of this committee, the Equity and Human Rights staff presented proposed priority list to members to discuss that was based on previous community consultations. This served as the basis for which members identified what they believe to be some priority issues facing 2S LGBTQ communities in Toronto. So based on this feedback, the Equity and Human Rights staff have compiled a final list that will serve as the work plan for the current term of this committee to strategically inform its work. The proposed work plan includes poverty reduction, community safety, shelters, and housing. Divisions leading the work in these areas have been invited to present to the committee at today's meeting on September 27th, as well as on the December 8th meeting as well. A number of other areas of interest were also identified, including the preservation of cultural spaces, seniors in long-term care, and the work of the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate. So over the term of the committee, Equity and Human Rights staff will also work with relevant divisions to coordinate these presentations on these topics for the committee's consideration as well. So today, the recommendation is that the advisory committee receive this report for information.
Thank you very much, Janice. That brings you to the end of your presentation. Okay, thank you. Are there any members on the committee with questions of staff? You're all very satisfied with today's presentation. And Janice, just so you know, I think that might have been the shortest presentation. Okay. Well, even though it's brief, I know it represents the body of work that's ahead of us. I look forward to doing that work with you, and I'm sure that the committee does as well. Can I have someone to receive the presentation then? So moved by Susan. Thank you. All those in favor, indicate your support. Any opposed? That carries. Thank you very much, Janice. Okay, item number 2 will most likely not be so quick. It's the Toronto's Poverty Reduction Strategy. Wayne Chu, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. Just hold on one second while I share my screen. So good morning. Thank you. My name is Wayne Chu. My pronouns are he, him. I am the manager of the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office in the Social Development, Finance, and Administration Division. And I am here to provide you with an overview of the areas of focus for the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy to help inform your work planning considerations for the LGBTQ2S Advisory Committee. So the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy is the city's broad corporate strategy to address immediate needs, create pathways to prosperity, and drive systemic change for residents living in poverty in Toronto. It was adopted in 2016 through a very thorough, inclusive engagement process, and is a strategy that's to be implemented over a 20-year period, and I'm going to get into a little bit more details about that. But I want to first talk about the context of poverty in Toronto and how we understand it in the Poverty Reduction Office and in the city. So overall, 1 in 5 adults, 1 in 4 children live in poverty. This number tends to be quite consistent over time. And there's a recognition that poverty is systemic. In Toronto, as in many other places, it's increasingly gendered, it's racialized, geographically concentrated. And in Toronto, there is a particular concentration of poverty relative to both the province and the country overall. Very recently, the federal government adopted an official national poverty measure called the Market Basket Measure. Using this benchmark based on 2017 numbers, the rate of poverty in Toronto is roughly 1.8 times higher than the national rate, which is not surprising for those who, pay attention to the dynamics of the socioeconomic struggles of folks in this city. If you look at the specific poverty line measure, so the market basket measure is calculated regionally. So every region of the country has a specific threshold. For a reference family of 4, calculated by Statistics Canada, so that's 2 adults, 2 children, it's calculated to be $49,304. Obviously, the cost of living in Toronto is quite high, and so folks who are above that line are still struggling to make ends meet. But that kind of gives you a sense of where we are at relative to the rest of the country. Over the last number of years, in particular because of COVID, it's expected that poverty may have grown among Indigenous, Black, racialized, and other equity-denied communities, many of whom are essential workers and many of whom are service workers and were experienced layoffs and other economic impacts because of the pandemic. So we'll have more data to communicate to you as a committee and to residents overall coming next year. As you may recall, we recently had a census cycle, and that data will be released in mid-2022 with a precise update on the rates of poverty in Toronto. So I'd like to take a moment to nuance what I've just talked about as well with a specific lens on poverty within the LGBTQ2S+ community. As you may or may not be aware, data is hard to come by for many different communities, as systems are still working to embed disaggregated data into its data collection, but we do have signals of how particular communities are experiencing poverty. In this slide, we're summarizing some findings that Statistics Canada provided as they looked at the impact of COVID on the LGBTQ2S+ community. In 2018, sort of pre-pandemic, they found that LGBTQ2S+ Canadians were disproportionately experiencing difficulty in meeting needs in terms of transportation, housing, food, clothing, participation in social activities, and other necessary expenses. 1/3 of Canadians, respondents who identify LGBTQ2S+, reported finding it difficult or very difficult to meet their needs, compared to 27% of non-LGBTQ2S+ Canadians. And prior to the pandemic, LGBTQ2S+ Canadians were twice as likely than non-LGBTQ2S+ counterparts who experience some type of homelessness or housing insecurity in their lifetime. So when looking at the dynamics of what happened during is happening during this pandemic, we do expect that that these impacts have been exacerbated. Again, data will be forthcoming on what that looks like, but there is strong signals that this community is one that we do need to pay attention to when it comes to poverty. So, what is the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy? As I mentioned before, it's a 20-year strategy to make Toronto a city with opportunities for all, and it is very explicitly a strategy that is rooted in equity and reconciliation. We recognize that poverty is created by systemic barriers, that it's gendered, racialized, and geographically concentrated, and is a shared responsibility. So the City of Toronto is one of a number of different partners that should and are trying to make interventions to reduce and eliminate poverty in our communities. This is in addition to the federal government and the provincial government, which both have poverty reduction strategies, and the long tree of work that that our community partners and residents have been implementing and working on for many years to address these issues. The strategy was developed through a multi-round inclusive process of engagement that specifically placed people with lived experience of poverty at the center as community animators, as leaders, as key informants, and as validators to whether we've gotten the areas of focus right. There are 6 themes in the strategy: housing stability, service access, transit equity, food access, quality jobs, and living incomes, and systemic change that that comprise the strategy. Altogether, there are 17 recommendations in the strategy over the 20-year period that I will summarize in a moment. One thing to note in the way we approach our understanding of how to design and implement the various actions and activities that go into the strategy is that if we acknowledge that poverty is systemic, that we do need to take a systems design approach to this. Poverty is not linear. It is a result of multiple interacting factors embedded with a larger system. And the reason why we highlight that is that we are very intentional in indicating that there's no silver bullet to reducing and eliminating poverty. That it's not a matter of a single or a couple of traditional programmatic interventions that is important. I mean, they are important. We do need to provide programming and services for those in need in Toronto. But it also means that we have to keep our eye on the less headline grabbing, but fundamentally important underlying social and community infrastructure that has been neglected for quite some time. To that, we recognize that the City of Toronto specifically has a number of different levers that are available to it. Obviously, and traditionally, service provision is one of those key levers. An analysis of the budget from the previous budget found that every year there are billions of dollars spent on direct supportive services for Torontonians who are living in poverty. So as we implement the strategy, we're looking for ways to improve, create, or enhance services for residents that have a direct impact on mitigating the effects of poverty for those residents. We also have a policy and regulatory role, as you can imagine, as a government. In particular, policies and regulations related to space, for example. But all of this is highlighting the need to address ways to shift practices and create an enabling environment to improve outcomes for residents living in poverty. And we're also focused on the policy and regulatory environment in other orders of government. So On a regular basis, the City of Toronto does provide and take positions on policies at the federal and provincial level that have an impact on our residents. The City of Toronto is a funder through various funding streams. The City of Toronto provides direct funding, operating in some cases, and in most cases, programmatic funding to community organizations, grants and other supports, for example, space through things like the Community Space Tenancy Program that can help incubate new ideas or sustain supportive programs for residents living in poverty. And then the final three levers are levers that we don't always think about, but are very important in our work. So there's leadership. That as the largest city in Canada, as a leader in our community, the practices that we implement in our organization can have knock-on effects and influence other organizations to do better. And so, thinking about how we modernize and improve services and programs and ways of thinking for to improve the outcomes for residents living in poverty. There's stewardship as well. The City of Toronto has a number of different coordinating tables that bring together partners across the city or in particular communities to provide coordinated approaches to address the needs that are identified by residents. And that stewardship role is a very important one for the Poverty Reduction Office. And finally, as an economic actor in the city, our purchasing investment also plays a role. That, for example, in terms of just our procurement, we procure over $2 billion of goods and services every year. We invest in hard physical infrastructure, and we make other choices that actually provide economic investment in our communities. And we are looking at ways to be very intentional about how we leverage that economic investment to ensure that it's inclusive, equitable, and creates economic opportunities for all.
Wayne, it's Kristen speaking.
Yes.
I noticed that you
Yes.
have 14 slides and about 5 minutes left of your presentation.
Okay.
Just wanted to give you a time check. Thank you.
Absolutely. I will be very quick. So currently we are in the second action plan. So it's a 20-year strategy, but we implement specific actions over the course of each term of council. We're currently in the 2019 to 2022 action plan. The next action plan is the 2023 to 2026 action plan, and development of this plan will begin next year. From a reporting standpoint, we report through the executive committee. So the remaining slides are the major are the recommendations in the strategy by theme. For housing stability, we defer to the housing TO strategy, as the city does have a coordinated system-wide strategy to address housing needs in Toronto, and you'll hear about that shortly. In terms of service access and coordination, this was impacted significantly by COVID, but we are picking back up as we resume services. For this one, we are looking at ways to ensure seamless service delivery and ensure that that there is no wrong door for residents. Transportation equity, our flagship program is the Fair Pass Transit Discount Program, which provides discount to low-income residents currently in receipt of social assistance, childcare fee subsidy, and later this year in rent-geared to income housing. And we are seeking budget approval for full implementation where folks who are all adult residents in Toronto who are low income can get a discount on the TTC. With food access, we are currently in a refresh period as we shift the food strategy security work from Toronto Public Health, which is understandably focused on COVID responses, to our office in SDFA. Right now, we're focused on emergency provision, but moving forward, we'll be reporting on how we address food equity and food sovereignty in the city moving forward. quality jobs, livable incomes. There's a big focus right now on financial empowerment, in particular, getting folks access to existing benefits that are offered through the tax system that they may not be that folks may not be availing themselves of. But we're also developing models of inclusive economic development to figure out how we can do social and economic development differently in the future to be more equitable and inclusive. And finally, systemic change. So a big part of this is ensuring that residents have a say in decision making, and we have a lived experience advisory group as a program advisory body that provides us regular feedback on a semi-monthly basis and comprises residents who have lived experience of poverty, including people who identify as being LGBTQ2S. And a big part of our work going forward is to improve our monitoring capacity at the city. As I indicated at the top of my presentation, specific hard data is hard to come by on a regular basis. We're looking forward to taking a deep dive into the census data next year, which will, for the first time, be able to provide us with the capacity to disaggregate census data by those who identify as LGBTQ2S. And finally, in terms of inclusion and in decision making, regularly reporting to advisory committees at the city. So we currently regularly report to Aboriginal Affairs Advisory Committee, the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee, and look forward to the opportunity to reporting and providing updates to this committee on a regular basis, so you're in the loop. So that's my presentation. I know I stayed at a very high level because there is many, many things we could talk about. But if you have any questions at any time, we would be happy to answer them. You can reach us at prso@toronto.ca at any time. And I look forward to your questions.
Wayne, thank you for the presentation. If I can get the screen back so I can see the committee members. Thank you to the clerk. Are there any questions of staff on the presentation you've just heard? Lori, anyone else? And Ranjith. Lori, go first, please. And, oh, sorry, let me do this again. Lori, Ranjith, Paul, and Susan. Thank you. Lori, go first, please.
Thank you very much for that interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask more about your plans for monitoring the impact of the poverty reduction strategy in 2S LGBTQ plus communities. Given that census data as household level data have real limitations, so I'm wondering just what your thoughts and ideas are in relation to that.
Yeah. That question. We're really excited about this part, partly because personally my background is a research background, so I love digging into data. What we are working on right now within the office is a needs assessment survey to help inform the next action plan. We're still trying to figure out what the questions are, what sort of the delivery mechanism is, but we do recognize there is a data gap between sort of qualitative on-the-ground data and census data. So we're working on a survey right now within the office and trying to figure out how to fund this in terms to really get a large sample assessment of how people are experiencing poverty in Toronto, and to ensure that we are collecting demographic information so we can disaggregate it, including based on LGBTQ2S identity. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And we're also working with community members as part of a broad community research leadership table to find ways to collaborate on better data collection. This is in addition to the number of initiatives that other staff's colleagues can talk about in terms of disaggregated data collection at the city.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Ranjiv?
Thank you, Wayne, for the presentation. Quick question. I just want to quote from Toronto Star article very briefly. COVID-19 widened the gap between the rich and poor, it says, and this was February 23rd, 2021. So it says during COVID, find it. Yeah, so during COVID, richer Canadians have held on to their jobs, worked from home, built up their savings because there is nothing to spend on these days, and in many cases made a mint from rising real estate and stock market values. On the contrary, lower income Canadians lost their jobs or their working hours in the first wave, saw it again in the second wave, and now face the possibility of repeat if new variants are on their way. So I want to contextualize this because we are in a global pandemic, and this is an inequality pandemic. It has exposed systemic structural inequalities. I am working with LGBTQ plus refugee and newcomer people, and they are those lowest of the lowest income bracket. So I wonder whether you had data on your slide on LGBTQ2S lens on poverty. When you include those data, whether they are also captured, their statistics are captured, and that's one thing. And the number two is whether you had the chance to look at the concurrently the rising in an income inequality reports. So there is the rising poverty, and then what about the rising gap of inequality? So these two also needs to be put in context when we make our policies. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And it's a good one. And I think it does highlight sort of the point that we're talking about in terms of poverty being systemic. And so when we talk about poverty being systemic, it's about income inequality, economic inequality as well. And so that is a very much a lens that we take to the design and implementation of the strategy. From a data perspective, it is hard to sort of, as is indicated, data is at a granular level is hard to get at once you start sort of cutting it by different intersectional identities, but we are trying, and we're trying to improve our capacity to do that. But part of it as well from an implementation standpoint is ensuring strong collaboration between different units at the city that have carriage of various different strategies. So my office is responsible for implementing the poverty reduction strategy, but we also have, for example, you mentioned refugees and newcomers. We have the Toronto Newcomer Office, which is also within our division, and working closely with that office to make sure that our plans are aligned. Same thing with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Office, the Indigenous Affairs Office, Equity, Diversity, Human Rights, etc. Just to make sure that we're not working in silo, that we're all addressing these intersectional issues. Trying to stay coordinated and this big behemoth of an organization we have is sort of the way we approach that.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Paul to ask questions. Sorry, Councillor Ainslie to ask questions.
That's okay. Chris, you can go with Paul. I only make my father-in-law call me Councillor.
Thanks, Paul.
Wayne, I've got a quick one for you, and I appreciate the presentation and all of the information in it. It's given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure people will keep thinking about it. I just wanted to make sure that the slide deck gets posted publicly on our agenda, so we can go back and look at it if we want to give it another look.
Yep, absolutely. I believe the clerks have posted it online.
Oh, okay, because I don't see it yet. So I just want to make sure it gets posted on the city website with our agenda.
I think, I don't know if anyone from clerks can speak to that.
It's not urgent. I just want to make sure it gets done.
Councillor, it is on the agenda and publicly posted.
Oh, okay, perfect. Maybe my laptop needs a refresh. Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate it. That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Susan, to question staff.
Hey, thank you for your presentation. Susan Gapka, she, her pronouns, elle français. My new skills. I really appreciated the poverty reduction strategy, and actually didn't get a chance to comment because of time, but also I think we've got a good work plan that I feel like we did a really good, we set if we can get just part of what our work plan has, especially around poverty reduction and the other things in our agenda, I think I feel pretty proud of ourselves. On poverty reduction, I've been asking the city for years now to specifically highlight I don't want to say the plight of trans people, but I will, just the disadvantage of trans people in the city of Toronto, in Ontario, and across Canada, only having our rights codified in Ontario. And it's like 9 years ago. I can't believe it's been that long, and federally since 2017, 16. We've got some catching up to do around the disparity and the disadvantage. Things like housing and access to health care, social determinants of health, for example, we all benefit from across I'm going to try to say the 2S LGBTQ plus spectrum. But when we make it an acronym and the default of gender identity and gender expression, when we use facilities, and I did say we, as myself included in the trans with transition experience category, additional hardship around accessing some of those services because of how we're housed or how we're situated in a binary spectrum. And not to discount racialized, Indigenous, and other and people with disabilities within the trans spectrum. Even there's an incremental intersectional hardship. So I'm hoping that moving forward in the data collection that, and thank you for, I see heads nodding in acknowledgement, and, not to, but to have some specificity around the data and the collection in your survey. So I'm so glad you said you were engaging in a survey, but perhaps as we roll this out with the Poverty Reduction Advisory Committee that you talked about, just wondering how much work they are doing on the specificities between, because when we use the acronym, we have sexual orientation and gender identity, and sometimes they're interwoven and sometimes they're distinct from each other in their disadvantage, especially, and I'm thinking of income security as well. So anyways, that's 3 minutes, and just I think you've got my intent here. I think it's understood that specificity around different communities, and when we do in community engagement or consultations with the public, perhaps we could have some specific attention to each of those categories so that no one is left behind in the city of Toronto. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate your leadership, Susan, over the years with the the development of the poverty reduction strategy as well. I think you raise very important facet to how we think about this work. That it's not, like you said, it's not about categorizing, putting folks into a bucket, that we have to take differentiated approaches and more flexible approaches to how we deliver services, how we design programs that speak to the actual specific needs of folks living in Toronto without universalizing, a single experience to reflect all others. To that, we're working. You mentioned two things, right? Housing and access to healthcare. So again, there's a specific presentation of housing, so I'll let my colleagues do that. But even on things like healthcare, where we are seeing through COVID, the equity impacts and how COVID is, like the impacts of COVID are impacting people in very specific ways, that you can't generalize, right? And so even ways in which we can work with healthcare to provide better access to services that are specifically tailored to the needs of that particular person. We have, for example, a memorandum of understanding with the Universal Health Network called the Social Medicine Initiative, where we're trying to figure things out like that.
Wayne, thank you very much for your comment. Anyone else for questions of staff? Seeing none, we'll just move to the speaking portion. Anyone for comments about the presentation? Seeing none, I will just take a moment to move to receive the staff presentation and thank them for their work. I recognize that we are receiving obviously a high-level presentation. Within every single slide page is probably hundreds, if not thousands of hours, largely carried forward by the leadership of community members as well as city staff to make sure that every theme is appropriately addressed. I do want to lend my own voice in support of what Susan as well as Lori has just specifically highlighted, and that is about the need for benchmarking and disaggregated data collection, but also making sure that when we do take a look at how the reports come out and how the data is analyzed, is that at this point in time what I'm seeing is that there's an aggregated approach to the 2S LGBTQ plus experience, and I don't think that we're going to be able to get to proportionate resource and investment responses to prevent further poverty and to eliminate poverty for this community that's most hit until you get to the disaggregated portion, even within the stratified sort of aggregated data sets. And I just want to highlight that because there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Just as much as we know that people living in Malvern and Jane and Finch, or even in the downtown east of Toronto, all need different resources. Within that body of those neighborhoods, you have unique experiences and lived experiences that have to be really looked at and addressed. And I just want to highlight that when it comes to poverty, I think that we can all recognize that poverty is a form of violence. It is absolutely critical that we try to keep people safe, and there has been tensions and points of times where things have not been looked at comprehensively. So I want to recognize that when it comes to racialized BIPOC trans women in particular, they are most subjected to violence. They also happen to be the most subjected to poverty. So to Wayne and to your team at SDFA, I know you folks are doing this phenomenal work, but I just want to make sure that we don't lose the intention of making sure that the disproportionately impacted and affected communities get the proportionate responses and investments. Otherwise, nothing will change. And to move with a sense of urgency. I think sometimes 5-year, 10-year strategies don't get us to where we need to go when the need is so great today and the suffering is so great today. Thank you very much. All those in favor of receiving the report? Any opposed? That carries. Thank you, committee members. Our next staff presentation is coming from Valessa Faria. Valessa, are you on the screen? If you can just put your video on, we're handing the floor over to you. And this is, of course, to talk about safe, affordable, and supportive housing.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, committee members. I'm joined today by my colleague, Matt Hilder, who is a senior strategic policy consultant in the Housing Secretariat, and Matt will actually walk us through the presentation, and we'll both be available to answer any questions that you may have after. So Matt, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks, Valessa. If I could just ask the clerk to pass me sharing abilities, we will get going. Perfect. All right, good morning, Councillor and committee members. Just want to confirm you can all see the screen okay? Excellent. Okay, thank you so much for having us here this morning. As Valessa said, my name is Matt Hilder. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a senior strategic policy consultant with the Housing Secretariat. And we're here to speak to you today about our work in the Housing Secretariat leading the Housing TO Action Plan 2020 to 2030. This slide image here really speaks to the housing continuum, or the spectrum of housing that we are really concerned with here at the City of Toronto, all the way from emergency shelters to supportive housing, long-term care homes, and then market rental and affordable ownership housing. In order to support Toronto's vulnerable, marginalized, and equity-deserving folks, Toronto's housing system must continue to include responsive and equitable policies across the housing continuum, and many city divisions and agencies play a part in regulating and delivering programs and services across this continuum and are guided by a number of different policies affecting housing and homelessness. But most important among these is the Housing TO Action Plan, which we at the Housing Secretariat are the leads on. And we're here today because we are looking for your advice and guidance in how we can do a better job of embedding policies and practices that enhance 2S LGBTQ housing stability across this housing continuum. Following our presentation, I believe the next item on your agenda will be from the SSHA division, and they'll speak more specifically to shelters. And so today, our presentation speaks more to the housing portions of the housing continuum. Okay, so as I said, the Housing Secretariat is the housing lead for the City of Toronto, and we're responsible for leading and overseeing the delivery of the 10-year action plan. So we establish partnerships with Indigenous communities, other orders of government, private and nonprofit organizations, researchers, and certainly people with lived experience to grow and improve our housing system. We manage the planning and delivering of new, affordable, and supportive housing, the maintenance of existing housing stock through programs including the Housing Now Initiative, the Modular Housing Initiative, Rapid Housing Initiative. We have the Open Door Affordable Rental Housing Program, which supports and incentivizes new affordable rental development, and the Toronto Renovates Program, which provides low-cost grants and loans to individuals to help them improve their current housing stock. So the action plan itself was adopted by City Council in December of 2019, and it provides a blueprint for action across the full housing spectrum, as I mentioned at the top. The Housing TO plan sets a target to help over 341,000 households through directing new and enhanced strategic investments from all orders of government. It sets a target of approving 40,000 new affordable rental homes over the 10-year period, including 18,000 supportive housing units. The plan also recognizes the importance of protecting our existing affordable rental housing stock and lays out a number of actions to help people stay in their homes. And it also has strategies with respect to in-home care and long-term care options for seniors. The Housing TO plan also emphasizes the need to engage with communities and people with lived experience to develop housing and supports that's responsive to their needs and their strengths. And when developing the Housing TO Action Plan, we partnered with community organizations to host consultations, including organizations that work with members of the 2S LGBTQ+ community. Examples of partners that we worked with include the 519 and the Scarborough Centre for Healthy Communities. Individuals with lived experience as 2S LGBTQ+ were also consulted during consultations focused on youth and with people in long-term care and seniors housing. The consultations found, among other challenges, that 2S LGBTQ Torontonians face homophobic or transphobic treatment from landlords, roommates, and neighbors, including being denied access to housing. Some respondents identified insufficient housing supports and resources for members of these communities, and this echoed what is sadly and frankly already well known through research and from the work of advocates about the disproportionate risk of homelessness and housing instability that 2S LGBTQ communities face, particularly youth, trans people, and Two-Spirit, Indigenous, Black, and racialized queer folk, and certainly the intersections among all these identities. So in response to these and many other challenges we see across the housing continuum, the Housing TO plan proposes 13 strategies and 76 actions to be led by the city and its partners. Implementing the plan is estimated to cost all orders of government about $23.4 billion and really requires the commitment of the city, the federal government, and the provincial government to be successful. The image on the right of the slide here outlines the 13 strategies in our action plan, and I certainly won't go through all of them. That would take well over the rest of the presentation, but really we'll highlight towards the end of this presentation that there are a number of different items under different strategies that may be of interest to this committee. I do want to make one point, though, while I have the floor, is our fourth action related to providing pathways to support women. It's rooted in the recognition that gender-based violence plays a significant role in creating housing instability for women and their children. And in this work, we work with a broad and inclusive definition of woman that includes trans women and female identifying people. And our actions here rely on partnerships with the housing and homelessness sector that aims to provide safe options for women fleeing violence. So in terms of progress to date, we are making significant progress on the Housing TO Action Plan. Actually, our first annual update report will be coming to the Planning and Housing Committee and City Council this fall. In 2020, the city adopted a 24-month housing and homelessness response recovery plan, really driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate impacts on people experiencing homelessness. And this aimed to accelerate a lot of the work in the Housing TO Action Plan by creating 2,000 new supportive homes within 24 months. So we're working hard to deliver on this plan, and by the spring of 2022, with support from other orders of government, we will have created at least 1,248 new affordable supportive housing units for people experiencing homelessness. And these have been delivered primarily through the city's modular housing initiative and the rapid housing initiative, which has been provided funding through the federal government and CMHC. So speaking a bit more specifically to commitments in the housing plan to 2S LGBTQ+ people, the plan certainly recognizes that this community faces discrimination in the housing system, which creates significant barriers to realizing housing stability. There's a specific commitment to the 2S LGBTQ+ communities to respond to the challenges that we heard about through our consultations and research. Action 13 of the strategy speaks to the need to develop specific interventions for equity deserving and vulnerable groups with specific needs, including 2S LGBTQ+ individuals. We have committed to develop a work plan with key stakeholders from equity deserving and vulnerable groups and people with lived experience to meet these needs. You'll also note that in the Housing TO Action Plan and in our implementation plan, we make a commitment to develop a data strategy. And through the design and implementation of this data strategy, we really hope to strengthen the city's collection and use of equity-related demographic data in the housing system. This will sort of be the first, we believe, comprehensive housing data strategy across the country. And this will help us assess need and measure if we are achieving equitable housing outcomes across the housing continuum. So getting into the specifics and what are the next steps. So we continue to be strongly focused on pushing the delivery of new affordable and supportive housing, but we know we have work to do to ensure these new homes we build and other policies we put in place to support people facing housing instability need to be informed by 2S LGBTQ+ individuals and organizations that work with them. Some work we have on the horizon includes the delivery of the Rapid Housing Initiative, which leverages federal funding, as I mentioned, to develop new affordable and supportive housing. We've recently submitted a second round of applications to this Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation for evaluation in profit with a number of nonprofit partners, and are hopeful that some of those projects will be successful in the months ahead and will be geared towards creating housing for 2S LGBTQ+ people and youth in particular. While we can't speak about any site specifics right now, we hope that by late October we'll be able to communicate more about the successful projects. But we also know that safety and housing for 2S LGBTQ folk needs to be supported across all the housing options and not just in 2S LGBTQ dedicated homes. And this is where we need to develop strategies that enhance the safety of housing options for these communities, no matter where they choose to live. So there are a number of areas of work that would be of interest, we believe, to the members of this committee that have to do with supporting the needs and recognizing the strengths of 2S LGBTQ+ communities. These include our work on developing an equitable data strategy, the first data strategy in the country related to housing. We're also working with the City Manager's Office to establish the role or function of a housing commissioner for the City of Toronto, which would support the city in its progressive realization of a rights-based approach to housing. As I mentioned, have not yet mentioned, we'll be developing new affordable housing design guidelines, which will include considerations around accessibility and universal design and ensuring that housing buildings are inclusive and welcoming to all communities. And finally, the development of an access system for new affordable housing to ensure people in need of affordable housing are connected in a fair and equitable way to new opportunities. So these are some of the other areas in the Housing TO Action Plan that may be of interest to members of this committee. But primarily, we're at an early stage in this work, and I think it's really timely to be coming to this committee today because we're really looking for your advice and guidance in how we embed the voices and experience of 2S LGBTQ+ communities, including service providers, advocates, and people with lived experience, on any of the above initiatives, but specifically on our work to establish an advisory or a work group who can help us carry out this work and guide us through it. And with that, I'll finish my presentation.
Matt,
and welcome any questions from the committee.
Thank you, Matt. I suspect there will be a few questions. Thank you very much for the presentation to you and Valessa. If I can just get the screen and have the members raise their hand and let me know who has questions, and I'll start a list. Starting with Leslie, and then I see Laura's hand. Thank you, Laura. Anyone else? Susan and Lori and Jad. Okay, go ahead, Leslie. You go first, please. I think we just lost Leslie. Okay, well,
I am here. I'm here.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leslie.
I'm getting used to technology again. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. I have a comment and a question. So my question has to do, number one, with long-term care homes. And designated beds and spaces for queer seniors. I'm not going to use the whole acronym. So designated beds for queer seniors. There are 10 long-term care homes that are funded by the City of Toronto that are supposed to be queer inclusive. They're mandated to be queer inclusive, and they are not. Nobody's holding them accountable. And then there's Rikai, which has 2 campuses in the City of Toronto. And Rikai has taken the lead in designating 25 beds for queer seniors. They now have a waiting list, and it's the only long-term care home in Canada that's taken the lead in doing something like this. And given the fact that almost 4,000 seniors have died of COVID and more, I suspect, since the 3rd and 4th waves, how many of those seniors are queer seniors, and what are we doing to protect queer seniors who are forced into long-term care homes? And I'm happy to see that you have a strategy that's designated to help those of us stay in our homes. So I'm using myself as an example of a queer senior who is disabled. As you can see, I'm a lovely person of color, and I'm experiencing homophobia from my next door neighbor. I live on the brink of poverty, and I'm struggling to stay in my home. So my question is, how is your strategy going to help people like myself? And one other point, the Women's Co-op at Parliament and Shooter, a lot of my lesbian friends live there who are older. Many of them are women of color. And how can we set up more types of housing like that to house lesbians of color? Because many lesbians of color who are older now are struggling, and we are living on the brink of poverty. So that's my comment and my question.
Valessa, do you want to take that?
Yes, I will. Thank you for the question, Leslie, and through the chair. I'll start with the long-term care homes piece. So yes, the city does own and operate 10 long-term care homes. There are plans for redeveloping some of these homes to increase the number of beds. We will need to loop back with our colleagues in the long-term care and seniors division, specifically in terms of how they intend to make these, at least a portion of these beds more accessible. And it's something I think it has been raised at the staff level. We just need to loop back, and I'm happy to provide an update to this committee, perhaps at a future meeting. In terms of making our housing, the new supply, more accessible, as Matt has shown in the presentation, we are very committed to working with people with lived experience, and there are various avenues and big initiatives that we need to undertake over the next year. So, namely, looking at our access system to ensure, you've mentioned specifically queer women of color, and I think we understanding we'll have to, I think, as part of this work, develop not have just a broad strategy, it's not a one size fits all. We'll have to, hopefully working with people with experience, make the access system rather more inclusive. So that's a piece that we will take back. Matt will be leading an advisory group, which will be bringing recommendations to council and the Planning and Housing Committee in our annual update for 2022. And as part of that, there will be an update on what we've done to date, because one of our initiatives is looking at having perhaps one of our new locations dedicated specifically to 2S LGBTQ folk. And that is something we need to figure out if it's the right approach. We've started initial discussions with a number of service providers, but it's something that we ourselves in our office have highlighted as a priority. And to your next question about the housing for women at Parliament in Shooter, I must admit I'm not familiar with specifically that property or what what makes it. It seems from your comments, Leslie, it seems like it's inclusive. It seems like it's working, and we need more of it. So I think it's something that we are happy to to have a look at, and perhaps if you're open to it, I would be pleased to touch base with you outside of this committee, because if it's working, it's something we need to do more of, definitely. So I hope I've provided some information, and as I said, would be happy to discuss with you outside of this committee further.
Yes.
Vanessa, sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
I'm just going to say I'm happy to connect with you. The one question that you didn't answer was about helping somebody like myself who is struggling to stay in my home, and I'm living on the brink of poverty. So we don't have to discuss it now, but that's something that I need help with.
Okay, happy to take that offline. There are a number of income support programs, as well as Matt showed on the presentation. We also operate a Toronto Renovates program, which provides grants to help low-income seniors remain in their homes and do things like accessibility upgrades or improve the safety of their homes. So we can discuss that with you offline.
Great. You can get my information from Janice.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, both, and thank you, Leslie, for sharing that. Laura, to ask questions.
Hi, my name is Laura, she, her, and I'm a member of Pikwakanagan First Nation and settler descent. I've got a couple of comments. So the first is I would highly encourage anyone doing data collection, make sure that they're following OCAP principles, which is a First Nations data collection guideline around ownership, control, access, and possession. I think that communities have been data mined a lot and don't often get to have any control over how that data is used and their story is told. So that's the first. And then kind of like a series of interconnected points. You noted in your plan a point about buying homes. I think it needs to be just accepted that in Toronto right now, buying homes is inaccessible, and that it is more meaningful to put money towards accessible accommodations and affordable accommodations than buying homes. Buying homes right now just really, those programs benefit upper middle class, upper class in Toronto, and not who we're trying to target. I also, connected to that, you mentioned that you wanted to make sure that you're supporting folks no matter where they choose to live. Just an elephant in the room. Some people are choosing to live in tents, and there has been significant violence against these communities in the city. And this plan seems very building centric. And I'm loving these presentations because the frameworks seem wonderful. There's been consultation, they're considering intersectionality, all of these wonderful things. But in my experience in the last few months, that's not being translated to the actions we have towards people experiencing poverty. And really what the city seems to be doing right now is traumatizing these communities even more and driving us even further away from wanting to interact with the communities. So I guess my larger question is, how are you working with the front lines around these strategies, understanding homeness as potentially not buildingness, and thinking about confronting communities that have experienced trauma when working with you? How do you rebuild that trust, I guess?
Thank you.
Go for it, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for the comments and the questions. To work through them, firstly, thank you for the reminder around the OCAP data collection principles. That's really important and certainly something we're mindful of in our work, but need to be clear that we're highlighting that in the future. In terms of home ownership, I think you raise definitely an important point that many people in Toronto are very well aware of. And I think that one of the things with our affordable home ownership program, in terms of the scale of investments we have across the housing continuum, I would say that's a smaller piece of our work and our focus. And we're actually looking to potentially re-engineer that program and are going to be coming to committee and council, I believe later this year, early next year, with some proposed changes to our affordable home ownership programs and also some really good measurement and outcome tracking to ensure that those programs are supporting low and moderate income folks who are interested in pursuing home ownership. So that is a piece of work that we're aware of, and we want to make sure that our work in that piece of the housing continuum is also supporting our broader goals around supporting housing stability for low and moderate income Torontonians. And then lastly, I think you raise an interesting point around homes and homeness and buildings. I would say that in the Housing Secretariat, the way that we want to ensure that we bring in the voices of people, as you said, on the front lines and with lived experience, are through advisory groups such as this one that we're looking to establish. And we have other groups of similar nature elsewhere in our work. For example, a lot of our renter and tenant protection work is informed by people with lived experience. So that's one of the ways in which we try and bring those voices to our strategy and policy development. I can say that with respect to encampments, I think some of our other colleagues on the call may be better positioned to speak to some of the relationships around that work, but Valessa may have more to add to my comments. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Matt. Through the chair, the only additional point I will add is, as part of delivering the housing plan, we work very closely not only with people with lived experience, but also the nonprofit service providers specifically who support a lot of our equity deserving groups. And your point is well taken as well, that the plan focuses on building, but there are also many strategies that are very focused on protecting our existing stock, helping residents maintain their homes. So I just wanted to add that for additional context, and would be happy to if you'd like to have a discussion outside of the committee, happy to have that with you at any point. So thank you.
Thank you all. Just as a note of interest, our next presentation is coming from our SSHA staff. This is the Shelter Support Housing and Administration staff. I know they've been working very closely with the leadership table at the city with respect to the encampment approach. So that question, Lori, I want to make sure it gets adequately addressed, but I think the next group of staff persons are probably in the best place to answer that. So thank you. Next person to question is Susan, followed by Lori, then Jad. Susan, go ahead.
Hello, I'm still Susan, and I still use pronouns because they're the world we live in. So I have two questions. Actually, I just added one, and I'm communicating with the city clerk on whether, well, I'll go with that one first, is whether we are able at this committee to move a motion to oppose the current system of encampment clearings, which has caused me personally, and I think many others, a great deal of distress. So I have sent an email to the clerk to try to see if that's doable and looking for advice on that. The second question, and I'm learning here as we go, this is questions of staff, and then we have comments, but it's easy to meld them into two. Number 4, the presentation person, staff Matt, around the definition of women. I was looking at that. Point number 4 in the strategy was you gave a definition, and I heard so a little background on that. But understanding, I'm trying to move our communities into using gender rather than sex characteristics category. So you did say, I think, women, trans women, and female identified. So a little background on that, the rationale for using female identified, but knowing I got some significant pushback when one of the Ontario police forces decided to not identify victims or perpetrators of crime by sex and gender, which I thought was really important because so many misidentities, misgendering happens when that occurs. But you did talk about violence against women and how that's really important to be specific on that. So I'm thinking that might be part of the female identified category, but just wondering if you could provide us some background on how we got to this definition, please. And thank you for all your work on this file.
Thank you, Susan. By way of background, I think that really that work is in partnership with the Violence Against Women sector. And really the intent there is to be as broad and as inclusive as we can when we say women. So there wasn't any other specific intent behind that comment, and I appreciate your comment and the history that comes with that. But no other further background or history from my end with respect to how we go about that definition.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, is that time, or can I don't want to take too much time, Madam Chair, but just thinking of, I didn't mention non-binary people and just some ongoing discussion about definitions like that. I think just, again, we want to leave no one behind when it comes to housing as well as poverty reduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Lori, to question.
Thank you. Both Laura and Susan have already spoken to my question, which was about violent evictions of Toronto residents living in encampments. And I think I understand that that's better addressed in a later presentation. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Jad, to question.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Jad Jabed. I use he, they pronouns. So just to bring up this very important barrier that's facing newcoming immigrants, especially that, Middle Easterns there's a huge demographic of Middle Easterns and Arab and other, of course, POCs that come here. So when you arrive in this country, just a little privilege check, when you arrive and you want to get an apartment or you want to get a rent, the first things they ask you for is an employment contract or credit history. When you arrive here without an employment contract and credit history, for example, as myself, an economic permanent resident, on an economic express visa, what you end up doing is you end up being stuck in inequitable contracts. Because you don't have the prerequisites to negotiate, because you don't have the preliminary knowledge to hold your ground, you end up being involved in very inequitable contracts with folks that might harm you more than help you. And this is what happened to me. I find it interesting that I am a PhD, postdoctorate. I also acknowledge my white passing as an Arab as a privilege. I also see Leslie here. I'm also a director on Toronto's board of directors, and I'm being witnessed by you all here. And I'm also facing homelessness, and I'm also very close to the poverty line. As you all know, I did launch a nonprofit organization in this past year that serviced 4,500 people. And now I find myself, unable to even negotiate my contract, unable to move back and forth. The migrant caseworker that wanted to give me government support stopped because the contract itself is so inequitable, the original contract. And of course, I'm trying to get out of it, but without credit history and employment history, this is the problem. So what I would propose over here is something like a guarantors network. The guarantors network would be something that I would first advise for it to be culturally specific. So for example, you have a lot of for example, Persian entrepreneurs, for example, who would be willing to invest in Persian queer newcomer immigrants as guarantors. You have Southeast Asian folks who would also be interesting too. So I would propose a guarantor network that's very culturally specific. And I would also please just ask folks about the legal accessibility of issues. So for a person like me to feels like property management, they feel like monopolies. And they feel like, as Leslie also mentioned, that the level of accountability is so minimal between a small newcoming immigrant and this massive property management. I've had a cockroach and rat infestation for the past 6 months. My apartment conditions are unlivable in, and I have not been able to fix it. So just wanted to put these, and another point, everyone has lived experiences. We all have lived experiences. So this is my lived experience, and I hope that helped in any shape or way.
Through the chair, yes. Jad, thank you for the comment. I think you've pointed to an important intersection around newcomers and immigrants and their entry points into the access system. So appreciate your sharing that comment and perspective with us.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jad, for your comments. Anyone else at this point in time, questions of staff? Okay, seeing none, I have one quick question, and I recognize that we're going to run out of time if we take too long, but I do want to ask this question. The probability of us building enough housing in the short order that needs to be done in order for us to eliminate and eradicate homelessness seems rather daunting and unachievable, to be quite honest, because construction takes a long time and it's complicated. But at the same time, we have a number of units and apartments and empty buildings that don't seem to have people living there. So with respect to the tools that staff are using with respect to getting people indoors, a pathway into permanent housing, can you share with us where staff are as it relates to portable rental subsidies? So therefore, if there's 6,000, 7,000 people staying in shelters or in the encampments, if we were to provide them rental subsidies portable, they can choose to live wherever they want. We can probably deal with this issue, I think, more quickly, but also with giving people the autonomy and self-dignity that they're looking for. And I suspect it might be just as cost-effective. Valessa, Matt, can you share with us your thinking on portable rentals subsidies?
Thank you for the question, Councillor. And you make an excellent point. Portable rent subsidies is definitely one of the tools that's essential to addressing this challenging housing situation that we're facing in the city. As you mentioned, it's there are a number of units under construction right now, about 11,000, but construction does take time. We staff have been using the Rapid Housing Initiative, so that's federal capital dollars specifically for creating new housing. So the city was we were successful in getting approximately 232 million last year through that program, and that's what we are using to deliver the 1,248 units that Matt mentioned. So what we've done is we've acquired property and are doing renovations to create permanently affordable homes there. But going back to the portable the portable subsidy question, my colleague Gord, who will be delivering the next presentation, can talk to specifically how the city is using that tool to assist with the encampment issue specifically. So I know it is being applied, and as I said, Gord can perhaps give you some additional information during the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Valessa. That was my question. Burka, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm sorry to come in a little late, still landing this morning. I find with a lot of the work that's done around affordable and supportive housing, the focus continues to be like, how do we spend billions of dollars of like finding housing and whatnot, but the approach needs to also be policy changes and conversations about folks who are accumulating capital and wealth in the city, right? And so I'm wondering where the strategy sits in relationship conversations around the number, like, I know some of this is also not municipal, but it's also like there are municipal pieces in power here, whereas like multiple homeownership, Airbnb-ing, all those pieces, like where do those fit in relation to us also making the like supply change in the city and not just to focus on how do we keep making affordable housing happening while other people are accumulating wealth, if that makes sense? It's like, where's the strategy in relation to also taxation or policy changes that actually make it like less possible for people to just accumulate places that continue to like create poverty situations?
Through the chair, thank you, Burka. That's an excellent point, and city staff are also looking at addressing some of these issues through policy changes. So, for instance, City Council approved a vacant homes tax, and staff will be coming back to Council before end of the year with a report on how that will be implemented. So that's one tool to address the issue. There has also been some changes that were approved by Council in terms of how we regulate property sharing, I'll call it. So there, as you mentioned, it's not only about financial resources, it's also about our policy tools. So we're definitely taking that into consideration, and in fact, it's essential for us in delivering our housing plan.
Thank you very much, Valessa. I think Burka may be having trouble with their Wi-Fi connection. Burka, if you're there, do you have a follow-up question? You have a little bit of time on your clock. You don't have to use it. Just wanted to make sure you knew you had it. Okay. Let's move on. Are there any members who would like to speak to this item? Comments? Terrence, go ahead, please.
Awesome. Okay, so a couple comments. So first, actually, if you need some assistance with the advisory, I'd also be interested in that. I have a few, more than a few actually. Most of my youth that I work with tend to have to access these resources. And it's been quite challenging on multiple levels. First and foremost, trying to access it, find out the information, where it is, where do you apply, all that is challenging. But I was looking at some of the experiences that we've been going through with our youth. And for example, some housing programs where they have multiple youth living together is a great idea in theory. But if you do not pair that with mental health supports that can be explosive, where youth are triggering each other because they're coming from traumatic experiences, and that can exacerbate the situation. So just advice in when you're looking at that, it's not just housing, right? As we know, there's so many layers to it, and we have to make sure that we don't just say, okay, here's housing, and then now fend for yourself. We need to support in all aspects. Also, hold on, I'm just looking at my notes right now. Ideas for, you're looking to connect and continue in this work. So as you said, organizations, not-for-profits, connect with all the shelters. For example, my stream typically, I can't get youth into housing until they're in the shelters anyways, because there's a waiting list. So in immediate, you need to get them into those beds. So all the cities or all the shelters across Toronto, connect with them if you haven't already thought about that. But the other thing that came to mind, as I mentioned earlier, is accessing this information. So when doing this work, looking at how you're going to make this information accessible to the community. How do you share this information? Because it's like jumping through loopholes and having to ask one person, and you get redirected to another person and nobody really knows the answer. So making it more streamlined for the community to access and a lot more simplified would be great.
Jad, thank you very much. I think there was a bit of a question to the end of that, right? Sorry, Terrence, sorry. You're all on my grid on my screen, but your heads keep bopping around, so I apologize. Sorry, Terrence.
No worries. I don't know if it is already or if they've already been thinking about that. So it's yes, it could be a question, but it's really just to put it on their radar of things to consider.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I see Valessa nodding. Okay, anyone else to speak? Seeing none, Burka, welcome back. I just wanted to acknowledge that we lost you for a short portion. Did you have any final comments or a question, or were you good at that point? I don't want to take your time away from you, that's all. You're good? Thumbs up?
A response.
Burka, I apologize. I'm losing your audio in the committee room. Okay. All right, Burka, I apologize. If you can hear us, we're thinking about you. Hopefully we can have you back in the meeting very shortly. Okay, so real world virtual meetings. We're just going to move to the obviously we're at the speakers portion. If there's no one else who would like to speak, what I'd like to do is just quickly move a motion. And the motion will be placed on the screen that our committee requests the Director of the Housing Secretary to incorporate the committee's feedback into the Housing Secretary's strategy for engaging 2S LGBTQ plus communities. And I just want to say thank you to Valessa, to Matt, to the entire team on this particular file. I recognize that the issue around housing has become the issue in the City of Toronto, as it is in all urban centers across Canada. I speak to colleagues who are working in different cities, some of them working in the same capacity that I have in terms of holding public office. There isn't a single city, as far as I can tell, especially the big cities, that are not struggling with this matter. So your work is critically important to staff. I know that it's been very difficult. I do recognize that the challenge has been housing has not always sat neatly and exclusively, never exclusively, in municipal purview, but in the absence of provincial and even adequate federal funding, I don't think we have an option. We just have to step into this arena and get in there with all the different tools that we need to have at our disposal, and that includes realigning the revenue tools at the city. And I do think that there was a comment made earlier by one of the committee members about policy shifts. How can we actually do more with what we have, but also how do we get more resources and tools so we can do more? And I do think that it needs to be said that the proportionate outcome that is being extracted is not happening fast enough, which is why I keep raising the issue around the portable rental subsidies, because I do think that is a big piece of it's a big piece of the puzzle, and I don't think that that's been our primary focus. There is housing out there, it's just not accessible, it's not affordable, and I think to find a way for people to get indoors and permanently to have their own home where they feel safe, and to choose where they get to go. So as opposed to us placing them in places that they don't want to be, I really believe that the portable rental subsidies program has got to be robustly investigated, but also invested in. So thank you very much. Any questions of the mover? Seeing none, if I can, all those in favor of the motion before you, indicate your support. Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. Okay, so just being mindful of time, it's 11:05. We've got a couple of items left, and I know there's going to be good discussion. Item number 5, supporting two-spirited lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities in Toronto Shelter and Overnight Services Program. Gord Tanner, I see you on the screen. The floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. And through the chair, thank you so much for the invitation today to provide an overview of our programs and services at Shelter Support and Housing. My name is Gord Tanner. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Director of Homeless Initiatives and Prevention Services at SSHA. And as a member of the community, I certainly look forward to being here and sharing with you, this sort of high-level again presentation of our services. But I'm really happy to see this committee off the ground, and certainly here to provide any further information I can at future meetings as you see fit. I did have a chance to watch the YouTube video very quickly at your last meeting to help me prepare a little bit for today's presentation. And so hopefully you find that, and I'll add a few pieces to the end of the presentation, just maybe speaking to both the housing allowance or housing subsidy piece as well as our work at encampments in Toronto. Next slide, please. So our vision really is Toronto as a city where everyone has safe and an affordable place to call home. And our mission really is looking at trying to coordinate an effective system of shelter and housing services to improve the housing stability of people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness in Toronto. Next slide. So at SSHA, we manage a fairly complex service system of both emergency and transitional shelter beds, temporary programs for refugee claimants, 24-hour low respite services, a couple of 24-hour women's drop-in services, as well as our Streets to Homes outreach program that works with many community based organizations in bringing these services to people who are living outdoors, including at encampments. We also provide grants to over 150 nonprofit agencies, which provide a range of other services to help people find and keep housing. And finally, as part of our social housing unit, we also provide funding and oversight to over 250 housing providers with some 92,000 social and affordable housing units, including the largest organization, which is Toronto Community Housing. Next slide, please. So the shelter system, and this is where I come at the work. I'm in charge of overseeing our shelter system and our Streets to Homes program. It's made up of over 100 different locations right now, including 11 city-run shelters, 53 agency or nonprofit operated shelters, 4 shelter and shelter hotel programs for family and refugee claimants. We have 6 low barrier 24-hour respite sites, as I mentioned, a couple of 24-hour women's drop-in programs. And, certainly this whole system has gone through quite a transformation through the COVID-19 pandemic, and due to guidance and direction from our medical officer of health, we've reduced by about half the capacities or the occupancies in our base shelter system, and moved close to 3,000 people out of that system and into new accommodation, including 21 full hotel properties that we're leasing and a few other sites that are assisting people as well. Next slide. I picked up on the last meeting that you had, sort of the conversation around, where are we at with adding new shelter beds to the system, and certainly thought I would share with you some of the additional beds that we've brought onto the system over the last few years. By the end, we've got a one sort of sitting out on the horizon there with 75 beds, but really at the end of 2022, we'll have brought on just over 1,400 new permanent shelter beds to the system. On a nightly basis at the moment, we're sheltering about just under 6,700 people per night across all of the programs that I mentioned. Next slide, please. And before the pandemic, really, we were trying to move to a new kind of shelter model, which are shelters really that are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that are, well integrated into neighborhoods and communities, and that offer space at shelters for community space. They're client-centered, they're pet-friendly, we're following the best design guidelines as we can. They're meeting green building standards and accessibility standards, and are again very housing-focused in terms of, as people come into the system, we're looking to develop housing plans with them as quickly as possible to try and ensure that people's entry into the shelter system is as short as possible. As I mentioned, the pandemic has certainly brought with it a number of different challenges, but that really is the spirit of which we'd like to see shelters operate in the future. Next slide. So actually, under the leadership of your chair and Councillor Wong Tam and a number of community partners, City Council approved funding for two LGBTQ plus youth shelters in our 2015 operating budget. In January 2016, the first of those programs opened at the YMCA Sprott House, which provides shelter services for 2S LGBTQ plus homeless youth. It's a 25-bed transitional housing facility, the largest of its time, largest of its kind at the time in the country, and was the first of two programs that now operate. The second is a transitional housing program that was opened just in December of last year. It's operated by the Friends of Ruby and offers 33 youth between the ages of 16 and 29, a place to call home. The location provides upwards of 12 months of housing for young people, depending on their need, with an option to extend their stay after the first year. And the services are really focused on providing a safer space where youth can access a range of different supports, including mental health, physical health supports, harm reduction, and community and life skills programming. The facility was once an underutilized Toronto community housing Victorian home that you sort of see at the front of the property. And it was really a coming together of all levels of government to support the opening of this site, and a whole lot of community support from the queer community as well. Next slide. So to give you a sense of how we understand who's experiencing homelessness in the city, we use a point in time snapshot that we do call the Street Needs Assessment that's held every few years. And really, this is really an enumeration of the number of people experiencing homelessness, both in our shelter system, in the violence against women's shelter system, including people who are living on the street, as well as individuals who might be admitted to healthcare, treatment, hospitals, and/or correctional facilities that have no fixed address. And alongside the count actually is a survey that happens, which tries to identify what the unique needs of people are in relation to housing. We conducted our first street needs assessment in 2006. And actually, the last street needs assessment we did was just in 2021. And the results of that needs assessment will be coming forward to the October meeting of the Economic and Community Development Committee, along with our service plan. So next slide, please. So what did we find in 2018? Well, in 2015 or 2013, for the first time, we started to ask, people about their sexual orientation. And in 2018, the data revealed that 11% of respondents identified as part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And more specifically, the 24% of youth between the ages of 16 and 24 identified as part of the community. Next slide. In addition, in the 2018 survey, we asked people, about their gender and how they identified. And 3% of the respondents identified as transgender, genderqueer, nonconforming, or two-spirit. Next slide, please. So for the assessment conducted in April 2021, there was an indoor survey week from April the 19th to the 23rd. We did the outdoor snapshot on April the 27th, and the indoor count in all of those various types of settings on the 21st of April. And so, as mentioned, some of the results will be released along with our service plan at the October 21st meeting of the Economic and Community Development Committee. Next slide. So since we started, asking people about, their sexual orientation and membership within the 2S LGBTQ plus community in 2013, for the last street needs assessment, we worked closely with Dr. Alex Abramovich to assist us in making sure that our gender identity and sexual orientation questions were diverse and inclusive. Training was provided for staff conducting the surveys so that they were sensitive to the way to ask questions, and also were asked to sort of show a list of response options to respondents so they could see themselves identified and reflected in the questions asked. Next slide. So how has some of this data informed our service delivery at shelter support and housing? So, since we started to ask these questions and certainly understand that we have a number of people experiencing homelessness from the community, our cultural competency training is now mandatory for all shelter staff, and not just including our sort of frontline shelter workers, but also those staff that might be doing maintenance in facilities or hospitality and management staff as well. We established a specific 2S LGBTQ plus work group that assisted to provide us input into our 2015 shelter standards. And that will be an approach we use again when we update our Toronto shelter standards, likely within the next 18 to 24 months. And finally, as discussed, this information was essential, or data was essential in helping us in getting approval and funding for the two new 2S LGBTQ plus youth shelters as well. Next slide. So our first service plan, Housing Stability Services Planning Framework, was approved in December of 2013. And the newer service plan will be coming, as I mentioned, to the October meeting. To develop the service plan, we engaged with frontline staff, service providers, service users, to help us identify what our priorities would be for the coming 3 years. In addition, input from over 500 people gathered through online surveys, virtual engagement self-sessions, and self-consultation kits in the spring were analyzed and compiled into an engagement summary report. Two of our key informant standing groups, of course, include the Toronto Indigenous Community Advisory Board, as well as the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness. And so again, looking forward and happy to bring you an update once that service plan comes through committee, perhaps in its next cycle. Next slide. And next slide again, maybe. So additional plans in terms of supporting the community and people who use our shelter system. We work very closely with the Toronto Shelter Network, which is a formal network made up of many of the nonprofit shelter providers that deliver our services. And they released in 2020 transforming the emergency homelessness system. And so that study provides a number of recommendations regarding how we can improve to support and ensure the safety of two-spirit, trans, non-binary, and gender-diverse clients in our shelter system. It engaged service providers and many clients to give their opinions, ideas about safety and inclusion in the shelter system. And many of those recommendations will be finding their way into our service plan that will be forthcoming. And then the final slide, just before I think we'll get into some conversation, is there is no doubt that as the shelter system has continued to get larger and provide this emergency response, the issue of safety is very important to ensure that people feel safe in both accessing the system, but also feel safe to stay in the system. And certainly, you know, I think what we've heard from some of the people that are living outdoors and at encampments is this whole issue of shelter safety has been something that the city urgently needs to address to you know, come up with an accessible system that meets the diversity of needs that we see across the people that experience homelessness in the city. So we will be partnering with CAMH on a 2-year study to really unpack this idea of shelter safety and understanding how you know, issues of safety in the emergency shelter system play out for both people who use the system, but also our staff. You know, understand how we can apply some evidence-based practices in promoting shelter safety, and also really unpack this whole issue of service restrictions and how how people's access to the system is restricted when there is a critical incident that comes up within the system. So we're at the very early stages of this. I'm happy to say we just had some funding approved, so we will be moving forward with the study, and certainly it will be grounded with all of the variety of stakeholder communities that have access and are playing a role within the shelter system itself. And then, sorry, there is a last slide. Sorry about that. One more slide. And then, you know, I think in terms of talking about some of the issues that have even come up at the meeting so far, obviously we know homelessness is a complex issue, and it really cannot be solved by any one organization, sector, or even one level of government. We currently require urgent action from the provincial government to address a number of issues amongst individuals experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. First off, to address the opioid crisis, that it continues to take people at levels that are well beyond what we've seen related to the COVID-19 pandemic. There urgently needs to be action and a comprehensive plan in place for people who use substances, which includes a variety of different approaches to access treatment and other supports. Similarly, you know, with respect to the number of people we see that have, you know, unmet and undiagnosed, perhaps mental health challenges in our system, again, these challenges are large, and so we do need the support of the province in this work to gain some traction and move forward. I think we talked about the housing TO plan, so I won't go into any more detail there, but maybe just flip a little bit to a couple of the questions that came up. And so you can take down the presentation now if you like, and I'll speak to the 2 questions that came up. Thank you. The first was around housing allowances, and I think through the chair you mentioned, what will the role of housing subsidies be in the future of supporting people find and keep housing? So we have used housing allowances quite often in the past and currently have what is a $600 a month housing allowance that's available to individuals who would fall into the category of being chronically homeless, which 6 months or more perhaps being homeless or in our shelter system. We recognize that that $600 allowance is not enough, even when it's added to somebody's income support program right now, to meet the average market rent in many neighborhoods across the city of Toronto. All of these funds come from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. So our ability to flex and stretch that housing allowance are limited. However, it is something that staff are taking a look at to determine how we can offset some of the very expensive investments in the emergency shelter system, and actually come up with some more deeper housing subsidies to get people into housing with the supports that they need to be successful. The second piece is just related to the comments around our work at encampments. And so first I'd say that, at shelter support and housing, we don't hold the enforcement role of any of this work at encampments, and our frontline staff, most of whom work at the Streets to Homes program, either city staff or in many of the nonprofit agencies that do the street outreach, along with partners in the community health and the Inner City Health Associates group, have been out during the pandemic and throughout, connecting with people and trying to engage them and providing supports and pathways into really the shelter hotel system. And in fact, we've opened a couple of downtown hotels specifically to try and meet the needs of people coming from encampments, and they've filled up. We are now very focused on trying to bring a more housing focused approach to our outreach efforts at the current time. So a few of the encampments we're engaged in deeply right now, it's really trying to bring these housing resources that Valessa and Matt were talking about previously, of some of the new supportive housing projects, and providing a pathway directly for people from the street, from encampments, into housing, again, with their supports. Because in listening to people at encampments, I mean, what they'd like is permanent housing that's safe and an adequate place to call home. And that's really where the focus of our efforts are currently. I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions, and back to you, Councillor Wong-Tam and Chair, for you to facilitate that next step.
Thank you very much, Gord, for your presentation and for answering the last two questions from the presentation from the prior item. I am going to build a speakers list. The first hand I saw up is Jennifer. If I can get hands, please. Ranjit, Susan, and Terrence, and Lori. Okay, we will start with Jennifer. Go ahead, please, Jennifer.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer White. Pronouns I use are they, them. I guess a couple, I agree with Susan. It's kind of hard to do question without a comment as well. So a couple of things. Gord, I know you well. We work together in a number of capacities, and so thank you for sharing. I guess I just want to highlight a couple of things. I also worked on the Toronto Shelter Network report for creating safer spaces and looking at what that means in the emergency sector for trans and non-binary folks. So just a couple of pieces there. One, you mentioned a number of approximately 6,700 people accessing the supports of the shelter sector and what that looks like and the programs that are being offered. And if you kind of look at the numbers identified in the street needs assessment, especially for 2018, that's a staggering amount. If we're talking about 11% of the population identifying within our communities, that works out to approximately 730 folks potentially that might identify within the community. And if we're looking at young people, you've identified 58 beds that are designated for that particular population, and that's only the youth sector. So that's a really high number of probably the adult population as well as youth population that are not being serviced and not being provided safe spaces. So just kind of one, again, identifying that's a large number of folks who are not necessarily living in safety. Two, the question to that is, what more is being done to provide safe space for folks identifying within our communities? And two, you talked about the temporary hoteling programs that have been made available for folks. And just going back to Kristen Wontan's, comments about portable subsidies, would this money not be better served providing, instead of the money, I don't know if folks are aware of the money that it costs to operate these temporary hoteling programs, but it is way more than we are, currently using in our shelter programs, our funded shelter programs. Would it not be better served to put that money into either creating subsidies for folks so that they can just move directly into housing? I think that would, the rental supplements would go a long way there for putting people into permanent housing with those rental supplements, as opposed to the money that's going into those rental programs or those housing programs, as well as being able to provide an astronomical amount of support to folks moving into affordable housing or permanent market housing, even for that matter, because I think those dollars would go a long way there. So just comments or thoughts on that, Gord. I know I'm not the only one who's asked that question in the sector, so any thoughts would be great. Thanks.
Yes, thanks so much, Jennifer, for the question, and through the chair. To your first question with respect to the numbers of people that are likely identifying as part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, and the number of dedicated spaces we have for them within our shelter programs. You're right. It's very small, and we could be doing a lot better. I think that at the same time, we are trying to create safer spaces across the whole shelter system so that, many of the programs are safer than a specific program for the 2S LGBT plus community. So we're coming at it at two places. I'd say that we've got work to do. I specifically would like to see us, create more space, not for just youth, but for the adult population as well, including, trans folks and people who identify as non-binary. It is very challenging. So in the short term, what we're doing is looking at dedicating some of the rooms in our shelter hotel system that can be specifically saved and on standby for people as needed. But as we look for, and work closely with our real estate colleagues at every property across the city in terms of its availability and applicability to be an emergency shelter, certainly this is in our priorities in terms of more programming that's needed. In relation to the second question and the money, I mean, the math is clear. Right now, we're spending probably $220 per day per person to house people in a shelter hotel program. I mean, the cost, based on the sort of capacities that have gone down, the number and the cost has gone through the roof. So you compare that to what we could be doing in terms of a deep housing allowance, and with the supports, which are really key to support people as they move into housing. I'd say the biggest challenge here is, again, it's more a funding related challenge in terms of the way these programs are operating. Right now, we're operating programs very deeply from the COVID funding that's been available from the provincial government, which has terms and criteria, and which will ultimately sunset sometime in 2022. What we need is is again deeply affordable and ongoing funding commitments from the provincial government that will allow us to carry this forward. So but your point is well taken, and all you need to do is look at the math to determine that, you know, not only is it a more dignified and humane response to provide people permanent housing with supports, it actually is cheaper. And you layer onto that the you know, the quality of life and perhaps the other systems that people aren't interacting with, whether at ER or emergency systems, that business case is very clear in terms of where we should be looking in the future.
Thank you very much for the question and for the answer. Ranjith?
Thank you. My name is Ranjit Kulatilak, gender pronoun he or they, and I have most of my Canadian life for the last 10-15 years have been working with LGBTQ plus refugee and newcomer people. And refugee newcomer people comes from a very traumatic background, and they are first place quite often, 90% or even more. Their first place of residence is the shelter system in Toronto. That is where they face a new level of challenges, including racism to all kinds of rejection, accent stigma, stigma based on being new, stigma based on their names, their names are pronounced and spelled. All these things become added social determinants of health, adding to them. And there have been some good experiences of LGBTQ plus newcomers in the shelter system, and there have been some extreme horrendous experiences, including clients being assaulted and ending up at hospitals. So my question is this: when you did that survey, did you specifically identify the LGBTQ plus refugee and newcomer people in the shelter system? Because it is a unique category, especially if you are trans identified. In the trans umbrella spectrum, trans identified, coming with being new to Canada, racialized, Black, so important to identify, because hardly anybody accepts them. And shelters have become very violent places for people. Now, question number 2 is, I don't know whether you have done a survey to capture the actual experiences of 2S LGBTQ plus people in the shelter system. That should be including the newcomers. So you mentioned a comprehensive list of services that you have done and connections that you have made, training, and so on. My suggestion is, if you haven't done, to do a comprehensive survey of 2S LGBTQ plus people in the shelter system, and maybe a subsection of that as newcomers. That evidence will inform the priority areas, and it will be a win-win situation for better service. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Sorry, Gord. I just wanted to,
Chair. No,
sorry, I apologize, Gord. I just want to make sure that there was a question in there. Are you leaning in to answer the question?
Yeah. I think I picked up a couple of questions. Maybe one, you know, how do we work with 2S LGBTQ plus individuals who are refugee claimants in the shelter system, and do we know more about their unique needs in the shelter system? So, I mean, a couple of thoughts. One is we do have several refugee-specific serving shelters in the system, including folks at Sojourn House, Costi, Christie Welcome Refugee Center, and also do some work with the refugee houses as well, just with respect to people who are new to the country and how we can support them. I can take the question back based on our our street needs assessment data and do I guess a deeper dive into seeing if we can cross-reference how individuals answered the survey who identified also as being a refugee claimant and as part of the community. And I could bring that back for a future meeting for you to see, or be in touch with you directly on that. The most comprehensive data we have across the shelter system does come from the street needs assessment, other than there being some particular projects that may happen from time to time where we are surveying people specifically about their unique needs. But if you'll allow me, I'd maybe go back to Sojourn House and Costi and others to also ask them about some of the work that they've done in this field as well, and see if I could bring back some more specific information.
Thank you very much, Gord. Thank you, Susan, for your Ranjit, for your question. Next person to ask questions is Susan, followed by Terrence, and then Lori.
Hi, Madam Chair. Thank you for recognizing me. I have one question and two comments, and just looking for guidance on whether I can collapse that into this section to save time.
Susan, I know that the clerk is working on your motion. There will be an opportunity after the question period for you to move that motion and speak to it. So if you want to just restrict it to the question right now.
So the question, and I'll do a comment at the next part. On the needs assessment, it's to the city clerk. Thank you, Gord, for presenting on that. I was looking at some of the statistics. I've actually assisted in each one, except for the last one because of pandemic, and it was only internal staff got to work on it. And when I originally opposed it, but glad to have been part of and developing, the identity component on trans and two-spirit people. Could the city clerk forward us the information when the agenda or report goes to economic development on October 21st, please? Because for some of us who want to follow up on that before it comes back to this committee. And then, and I guess just really the comment, thank you, Gord, for all the work and working on this very dire situation in our communities, and all the work you and your predecessors and staff have done up to this point. Thank you.
Susan, thank you very much for the comment. Just to clarify, I think the clerk and I are trying to understand where do you want this presentation to go, or were you suggesting that Gord's presentation goes to the executive committee or the community and economic development committee?
Thank you for asking for that clarification. I should have been more clear that this committee receive, when the agenda goes to economic development with the street needs assessment, that we be notified of that so we can read the report when it's made public. Is that better, Madam Chair?
Yes, Susan, that is clearer. I will take it upon myself, and I know my staff are monitoring this meeting. We will forward you that link to all the members of the committee once the report is ready. Gord, you look like you have, your look is perplexing and quizzical. Is that all right with you?
Oh yeah, no, I'm good. I'm all good.
Okay, great. Sorry to read too much into it. Thank you very much, everyone. That's fantastic. So we'll make sure we flag you. We will forward you the link once it becomes public. Terrence, questions?
Hello, hi Gord. Terrence, he, him pronouns. So just trying to make notes as they're talking and do other stuff at the same time, multitask. But let me get into it. So how do I start this? So I've had, as I mentioned before, many youth in the programs, in my programs that have gone through the shelter system, currently in the shelter system. And as you were speaking, a few of them came into mind. And I totally appreciate Jennifer mentioning how we should take those funds from the hotels and put them into housing. Because I thought specifically, I mean, I have a newcomer youth that's in the shelter right now, and during COVID jumped from one organization to the other sheltering system. And when he was in the hotel in Scarborough, he was subjected to other populations that were dealing with other issues. And so that in itself was very traumatic for him, and very terrifying. So those things were not being taken account and were causing even more concerns, which then compounded into this exact same youth was not getting supported through these shelter systems because of the lack of training capacities within these organizations, and inevitably ended up going into a psychosis for a month and brought into a hospital. So finally he's been assessed and supported. And so this entire experience, that's just one experience, and I have many, but like that brought up so many different layers and issues. So one, asking, looking at capacities in trainings and these inclusive practices. So one, what are we doing for the capacities of these shelters in supporting, because especially now during COVID, burnout, how do we make sure that these organizations have what they need to properly support our community? Second, looking at holding folks accountable. You know, you can look within the or try to do that within the organization, but I think that there should, maybe this is a recommendation, there should be an external kind of reporting process. Whereas, you know, sometimes some organizations are easier to work with when it comes to these issues and bringing them to light for them. But a lot of times you get a lot of pushback and red tape. So an external reporting process where it's overseen maybe by the city. I don't know if that's possible. Hold on, look at my notes. Sweet training, medic. Yeah, got that. Okay. And I guess the other question, yes, the last one is for shelters in other areas of the city. So looking at making specific shelters, say in the suburbs. And I think that was mentioned at some point. That's something out in Rexdale that I've been trying to work towards. We have very limited shelters in Rexdale. We have Youth Without Shelter, and we have Ernestine's Women's Shelter. And just within those, it's very few staff that are supportive and inclusive. I work with them directly. There's no real processes, but I've been wanting to create a shelter specific for the 2S LGBTQ youth in Rexdale, because my youth, honestly, it's hard enough that they get thrown out, kicked out, you know, like it's traumatic, and now they're uprooted out of their homes into a whole new neighborhood, disconnected from their friends, which are, you know, the only kind of stability they have left. So there needs to be shelters within particular communities as well. Those suburbs, the Malvern, Jane Finch, all those that were mentioned. I think we need to be looking at that as well.
Thank you very much, Terrence. Lori.
Thank you very much for that really informative presentation. I just have two quick questions. The first is just a question of clarification from the presentation. I'm sorry if I missed this, but on the slide about number of new shelter beds, there was an acronym GSR, and I'm just wondering what that stands for. And then my second question, I'm not sure if this overlaps with Susan's motion, but I just want to check in if I understand correctly that you are responsible for the work doing outreach to those living in encampments, but not responsible for the enforcement in terms of eviction. And so my question is just who is? Thank you.
And so thank you through the chair. Lori, the first off, the slide, you can use acronyms. GSR refers to the George Street Revitalization Project. So, you know, there is a project underway to redevelop Seton House, which was traditionally the largest men's shelter in Toronto. And so in doing so, we're moving and creating different shelters while that redevelopment happens, while that site is redeveloped and actually comes back with a long-term care home, along with a couple of shelter programs at that location. So sorry, that's the acronym that was used there. And yes, with respect to the encampment work, you know, we don't hold any enforcement powers at SSHA. Those enforcement powers are held by, you know, Parks, Forestry and Recreation, Municipal Licensing and Standards. And I think the work that you saw that was undertaken over the summer was led by the Office of Emergency Management. So, you know, when those when those clearings happen, I mean, we were there in the capacity to continue offering support to people who on that day may have wanted to seek supports and come indoors. So certainly we were there, but our focus continues to be in connecting with people and trying to get them into housing or other kinds of support.
Thank you very much, Gord. Thank you, Lori. Lori, do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Anyone else to ask questions? If none, we'll move on to the speaking portion. Okay. Then speakers. Susan, are you ready with your motion? Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Susan, please.
Yes, well, speaking, two comments are speaking about everything that I said in the earlier.
Sorry, Susan, I apologize to interrupt. Maybe I should have been clearer. If you're ready to move your motion, if you can move the motion, the clerks will put your motion on the screen, and then you can speak to the motion.
Okay, I didn't know comments was for motions, because then next time I'll know to put my comment in the question period. There is a motion. Do you want to move a motion on the enforcement of encampments? And it should be coming up on the screen.
Susan, I apologize. We're just struggling here on the clerk's side.
Yes.
Maybe what we'll do is just deviate a little bit. I do recognize that you do have a motion. The motion, it might be coming up now. There we go. Okay, thanks, Jonathan.
Okay.
Go ahead, Susan. You want to introduce your motion and then speak to it?
Well, okay, where are we here? Advise, well, the motion is read, advise City Council that our committee, it should have two-spirit at the beginning of that. I just caught that now. Opposes the excessive armed police presence in the clearing of encampments in the context of the city homelessness and housing first solutions, and supports a strategy of de-escalation and access to social determinants of health. Requests that City Council, so this is advice to City Council to oppose the excessive armed police presence in clearing of encampments in the context of the city's homeless and housing first solutions. And so I'm hoping that members will support this, understanding that what we do in the shelters is different than the enforcement piece as described by the staff report by Gord Tanner, but also understanding that to get people into social determinants of health, access to housing, income security, poverty reduction, we can't do that under the force of, can I say force of a baton, and that I was horrified to see the pictures and the reporting coming out about the escalation of the situation. And I understand that many other members of our communities across, Toronto, but across Canada as well. But and especially the disadvantaged queer and trans people in our community parks, just trying to survive, especially done under a pandemic, and how we need to really be offering supports for people who have been experienced trauma and damage because of their experiences, and that we really need to give our more vulnerable people a hand up in society. And so shelters, yes, for shelters that are inclusive to trans and queer people, yes to housing and all poverty reduction, but not in the way that we've experienced over the last 6 months in Toronto.
Susan, thank you very much for your motion. Are there any questions of the mover? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Susan. Anyone else who'd like to speak to this matter, to the presentation, what's before you? Okay. Seeing none, thank you. I'd just like to add my voice of support to Susan's motion. I think that it's a timely motion. It's a motion that probably captures the sentiment of many people who watch the encampment clearings. I've said before that we need to be able to recognize that homelessness is not and should not be a forever item in this city or any other city. It is something that the City of Toronto must strive to end, which is why declaring homelessness a crisis and emergency in 2016, 17, 18, those failed attempts was disappointing. However, we can also recognize that a tent is not a permanent solution to housing. It's not sustainable or viable in the long run, but there has to be a different approach. Susan, I want to thank you for your motion. I think it captures quite well some of the items that will be discussed at City Council this coming Friday. I myself had submitted an administrative inquiry to just understand better how the police response was deployed. Why was it so large? Why was it so heavily armed? Where did it come from? What was the risk assessment? Who made the call? I think members of the public have the right to know. I do want to also recognize that, it has been a very challenging time for many of those who work in the shelter system, who are working on the front lines and providing supports to not just the encampments, but to the residents. And Gord, this includes the incredible team at SSHA. I know you've been put in an impossible situation as you try to navigate the many different tensions. And certainly I want to recognize in front of the committee that, even if you have a seat at the leadership table at the emergency command center, it is not SSHA that's making that absolute call. And I want to just make sure that everyone on this particular this committee understands that there are a number of different actors that are there that are working collaboratively together, and how those decisions are made is not always left to one person or one division. So we're very interested in seeking the truth. I think we all want to do the right thing, and doing the right thing means understanding what happened so we can learn from it. And I want to make sure that is the spirit of how this motion is being voted on, is people are seeking the truth and they're looking for a way out of the homelessness and out of the encampments and into sustainable, permanent, safe, decent housing, which I believe we all agree everyone has a right to. Any other speakers? If seeing none, we'll just vote then. Lori, go ahead, and Ranjith.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask if that information could be shared back with this committee around what happened and who made those calls.
Lori, and maybe I can take that question. There are two matters before City Council on Friday. One is an administrative inquiry that I put forward that has asked a series of these questions, and the answers are expected to come before Council. The second is a member motion from Councillor Matlow and Councillor Layton asking for a municipal review and inquiry. So I think one way or the other, there are a whole host of eyes on these questions and hopefully the answers. I will ask Tyler Johnson, who's monitoring this meeting for us, who works in my office, to send everyone a link to the city manager's response to the administrative inquiry, and we can of course notify the committee members of what happens with the member motion that was put forward as well, so you can track it. So thank you. Ranjith, go ahead. Comments.
I want to speak in support of this motion and also add that this is add to the fact that we should not criminalize poverty. What we saw in that police force removing people who are there out in the parks were in a way a criminalization of poverty and surveillance and criminalization of homelessness. So issues are outside, and I want to emphasize that we need to move beyond that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? And we're going to close it up. I see Burka's hand. Okay, Burka, last speaker. Go ahead.
This might already be included in the inquiry you're asking for. I would love to see the following conversations also focus on what are the economic decisions being made to continuously create Band-Aid criminalized solutions to housing, like whether it's the shelter beds that Jennifer mentioned or $2 million spent on encampments when like literally that money could house these people. So like, what is the like economic decision making that's happening around what solutions are being prioritized?
Burka, thank you very much. Are you ready? Thank you very much. I was just speaking to the clerk, make sure we have everything in order. There's only one motion that's placed before us. So all those in favor, Susan, would you like a recorded vote on this? Or no? Okay, so.
No, it's at the discretion of the chair.
Okay, thank you. I do believe that this is a rather important motion. If there's no objections, I'm going to call for a recorded vote. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
I will let the clerk administer that. All those in favor of the motion, please indicate your support by raising your hand.
So members, if we're conducting a recorded vote, when I call your name, please indicate whether you are in favor or opposed. Ashante Frey, marked absent. Burka Gupta.
In favor.
Jad Jabber.
In favor.
Elijah Bawa.
In favor.
Jennifer White.
In favor.
Councillor Wong Tam.
In favor.
Laura McPhee.
In favor.
Leslie Lee Kam.
Hand is up. Leslie, if you can unmute yourself and just speak into the microphone, in favor or opposed? You can't? Okay, no problems.
Okay.
In favor, hand is up.
In favor.
Thank you, Leslie.
Lori Ross.
In favor.
Thank you. Monica Forrester. Monica Forrester, be marked absent. Councillor Paul Ainsley.
In favor.
Ranjith Kulatilak.
In favor.
Thank you. Samantha Peters.
In favor.
Susan Gapka.
In favor.
And Terrence Rodriguez.
In favor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So, Chair, the vote carries with a result of 13 in favor. Carries unanimously.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everyone, for the discussion. I would like to add, I'm sorry, folks, I would like to add one new item onto the agenda, if I can have a motion to do that very quickly. Okay. Terrence, thank you very much. I think I saw your hand go up. Thank you. Terrence moves to add the item. The item will be circulated. It will be made public to you. It's a letter specifically from myself as chair to this committee, calling on City Council to express our dissent and disappointment, concern regarding the funding cuts to the HIV/AIDS programs and health services in Toronto starting in 2022. The letter will be available for you to read online, and we'll come back for a vote shortly afterwards. Okay, so moving along, we have a presentation, item number 6, Digital Infrastructure Plan Equity, Bias, and Discrimination Considerations. Alex, are you here? Okay, go ahead. The floor is yours, please.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I know it's been already a very exciting morning. Really, it's touching to see how thoughtful and active this committee is. So I appreciate your attention this morning. So my team, Hamish, Nabil, and I are very thankful to have the opportunity to present to you a draft version of the Digital Infrastructure Plan. So this is an area of deep and complex work. This draft plan encompasses a lot of the research, peer-to-peer learning that's already happened, as well as internal and external consultation. But in many ways, the work on the digital infrastructure plan, which we call DIP or DIP, if we're feeling especially chirpy, is not finished. So in many ways, this is actually the beginning of a lot of work. As you'll hear today, it's really about a rigorous approach to addressing the vast range of emerging public interest themes associated with technology and digital infrastructure. And you also see that it's both inward facing for city staff like myself, as well as public facing for residents and businesses. So the result is really a multi-layered and multifaceted policy document that's founded in the principles and vision that City Council has supported and approved over the past few years. As you've heard from Wayne in answering the questions earlier today about data in the poverty reduction strategy, and Matt in the, you had asked questions about equitable data strategy as well in the housing work. This is an area that's really touching a lot of the city's operations as we sort of intensify that digitization. And so overall, the last of my preamble is that, we're really here to discuss the role of technology in society and to look to the future on the type of place we want to live in. We also know that technology is a tool that more and more of us are using. But we also know that technology is not a neutral force. This means that digital spaces and digital solutions can replicate systematic barriers, biases, discrimination, existing inequities, many of which the committee today has already discussed. So really addressing those issues is one of those primary drivers that's put us forward for creating this plan, and it's one of those reasons we want to hear from you. So as we go through the presentation, really we want this this plan to benefit from your feedback. Does anything resonate with you? Do you see anything out of alignment? Please let us know, if you see, does this document support how you see the digital future for our city? So that's why we're here, and thank you again for your time. So if we can put up the presentation. So the goal of the presentation again is to provide you with an overall.
Alice, sorry, I apologize for interrupting. Who has your presentation?
I have the presentation, but I don't have access to share it on WebEx. If the host could just give me access, I can share it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Apologies.
Great. Thank you, committee members. Bear with us. And just so everyone is aware, I'm hoping that we can take a 10-minute body break or a little stretch break before we head to our last two items after this, this particular presentation from staff.
Okay, so I
Thank you,
am sharing it now.
Great. I hope this doesn't make you concerned that this is the smart city team that's before you today, working with technology.
Alice, we have concerns, and Councillor Ainsley is here, so he's the big champion.
Oh, yes, Councillor Ainsley is here. This is rather embarrassing. So thank you for putting up the presentation, Nabil. Okay, so very quickly, so the overview is we want to talk to you about the plan. We want to give you some specifics around the equity, bias, and discrimination policies in the DIP. And then we'll share with you some of the upcoming public consultations starting tomorrow. So as I mentioned, the team that's leading this work is called the Connected Community Team. We're situated in the Technology Services Division. And so we used to be called the Smart City Team. We changed the name in 2019 because when we really looked at it, we're not trying to, use technology for technology's sake. What we're trying to do is really seeing how technology and data and processes can improve quality of life in Toronto. So really we see ourselves as the Connected Community Team. So and the work that we're talking about today is really about how do we use digital infrastructure better, which is a big aspect of the Connected Community program. So what is digital infrastructure? You may be wondering. The way we've defined it in this plan is quite broad. So it's really anything that creates or exchanges or uses data as part of its operation. And so when we talk about this, examples that come to mind are sensors, right? Using broadband, we're talking about being able to access the internet, Wi-Fi, applications, and also standards and policies like the open data standard. So the plan that we want to talk to you about is, again, it's called the Digital Infrastructure Plan, and we believe that digital infrastructure is changing the way that we deliver municipal services, leading to a number of positive outcomes and better management of public assets. And as the use of digital infrastructure increases, there are also some harms that can come with that we are trying to address with the plan. So really, it's intended to guide, again, guide work for staff like me on a day-to-day, as well as plan for that long-term strategy. We recognize there's a lot of unknowns when it comes to this realm, and so the plan is also intended to provide clarity and certainty for residents and stakeholders like yourselves. And to get into a little bit deeper, I'd like to introduce my colleague Nabil, who's going to walk you through the rest of the slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, committee. My name is Nabil. I'm a management consultant in the Technology Service Division. I use the pronouns he, him. To continue, maybe, and some of this conversation I recognize can feel a bit abstract, a bit divorced from reality. So we'll share a few examples of what digital infrastructure looks like in the city of Toronto. It can look like using new physical infrastructure like an automated shuttle. So new vehicles on the streets of Toronto that are using automated technology, and this is actually a pilot project that's actually taking place right now in the city of Toronto. You can sign up for sessions, and you can actually see this shuttle in West Rouge. And this is a trial right now to understand the public perception of automated vehicles, and to understand how to address gaps in the transit system. Another example could be free public access to the internet, and the City of Toronto has been distributing free internet access in TC8C buildings, in parks. So there's a few different kind of and in different locations across the city. That's another example of digital infrastructure. Providing better access to city services. And then finally, as Alice mentioned, you can use apps. You can, go download the waste wizard, and you can see, where does your waste go? What time? Where can you donate? These are all really tangible examples of digital infrastructure. And what we've found is that the city doesn't really have a consistent framework for guiding decisions that are related to these different kinds of technologies that are being used by the cities. We have a large organization and many different divisions that often have different rules around how they're collecting data, for instance, how they're sharing that data. And we are trying to put forward this framework that will guide the decision making and formalize the governance around these. So this document, as Alice mentioned, really serves staff, residents, as well as businesses and innovators in the city. It helps staff design programs. It helps residents understand what technology is being used and how it's being used, and it really provides a framework for residents to provide input into the design and delivery of digital infrastructure, and helps businesses understand how they can engage with this. And to just share, I want to set again the right expectations here. We're at the stage where we are providing a framework based on principles, which I'll take you through in a few seconds. We're recognizing that this is a rapidly evolving field of digital tools and technologies. There's a number of policy gaps, and in fact, we're still planning an implementation framework and plan for 2022 and beyond. But at this stage, we're presenting the principles, and we'd like to hear from the public on what resonates and what doesn't, and to the Accessibility Advisory Committee, specifically on the equity and discrimination principle, and what are the gaps that any of that you see in this. So to take you through the principles, this is based on 6 principles. 5 of them were approved by City Council last year in January, just before the pandemic, and the principles are equity and inclusion, a well-run city, social, environmental, and economic benefits, privacy and security, democracy and transparency, and digital autonomy. For each of these principles, we've identified a number of policy areas and then policy statements that will that identify how the city will really put these principles into practice. Some of the concerns that we've seen in the past are, you can say that you care about equity and inclusion, but how is it actually going to play out? And so this principle of equity and inclusion, for instance, the vision describes, how people can enjoy their rights and freedoms and feel safe and secure when accessing city services, and ensuring that all the use of data and technology is inclusive and responsive to user needs. This has 3 policy areas, which are of equity, inclusion, human rights, accessible digital infrastructure, and responsive digital infrastructure. And I wanted to note that earlier today we also spoke about disaggregated data collection and data analysis that would take place through the data for equity strategy, and that would actually then come to life, in partnership with this principle on equity and inclusion, as well as a digital equity policy, which we're interested in developing. The next is on a well-run city, ensuring that we're using data and technology to deliver high-quality, resilient public services, better outcomes. And this includes, and Councillor Wong Tam had mentioned earlier, better analysis of data, of disaggregated data as well, not just analyzing data in aggregate. That would be part of the work. There's a data and insights strategy as well that is underway within the city. So this would coordinate with that. Putting in place the OCAP principles that a committee member had mentioned, of Indigenous data governance, ownership, control, access, and possession, that would also fall under the data governance policy area here. And we have 21 policy statements that discuss this. Then looking at social, environmental, and economic benefits, thinking about how do we drive forward positive social outcomes? How do we, for example, promote reuse of digital tools? How do we create new opportunities for innovators and businesses, including for the creative industry, including for artists? That's part of what we covered under this principle. Then the privacy and security principle is of course of interest to many people. It recognizes that there's a risk to people's privacy and data integrity, and this is about how do we protect the security and privacy of data? How do we embed consent into Toronto's use of and regulation of digital infrastructure? How do we think about digital identity? And in fact, I'll just share that we had a conversation with the team that's leading this just a few days ago, and they've mentioned that they're actually changing that word from digital identity to digital access, because it's really about when you sign on, for example, to pay a bill on the city's site, how do we, how do they track, the person who's doing that? So, and because the province is also working on digital identity, because there's talk of things such as vaccine passports, they don't want people to be confused, and so they're changing this word to digital access. The next principle, democracy and transparency, and this is something that we learned over the years. We learned that thinking about the future of data technology is really thinking about the future writ large, and the public deserves to have their voices heard on these topics, and ensuring that there is stronger engagement. And ensuring that we're actually building trust and not just assuming, what people are comfortable with or not. So this is, and also thinking about how can we use digital tools and digital means to enhance democracy in the city. Even this meeting is an example of how, despite the pandemic, people are able to engage, but how do we continue using tools? And then another policy area here is on algorithmic transparency and responsibility, ensuring that we're able to identify and address issues of bias that can arise from the use of algorithms, which we know are often, they can be biased, they can be based on biased data sets. And so how do we create more transparency and responsibility around that? And then finally, digital autonomy. This is based on ensuring that the city and its residents have control over digital assets and infrastructure, ensuring that we're not subject to vendor lock-in, ensuring that digital infrastructure is always under democratic governance. So, for example, we don't want there to be a situation where, let's say, you're using an online tool and we can't do anything about it because there's a different private entity that runs that tool. Really, what we're hoping to embed is this autonomy and control over infrastructure and tools. We wanted to take you through different policy areas. To speak on the policy areas of equity, inclusion, human rights, here are some of the policy statements that are included. So, proactively identify and address systemic barriers that restrict the participation of farmers' diverse communities. Consider the potential realized consequences of digital infrastructures, including potential harm such as bias, discrimination, or privacy breaches, and ensure that safeguards are in place to detect, prevent, and remedy discrimination and inequity. Similarly, ensuring that there's access to the internet, improve digital literacy, awareness, and skills. Ensure that all communities have that face systemic barriers and discrimination have access to affordable internet and devices that meet user needs. Collecting social demographic and disaggregated data to identify and address inequities in public services. These are some of the principles. We have several more, but these are the ones that we wanted to highlight and share. On the point of transparency and responsibility, the algorithmic statements are as follows. Ensure that AI, artificial intelligence, is responsible, accountable, and human-centered. Develop a registry, and this is, to our knowledge, the first of its kind that it's proposed in Canada, a public registry of algorithms that are used at the city, that also describes how those algorithms are being used and how people may interact. Ensuring that, describing that how algorithms are operating in a fair and non-discriminatory manner. Putting in place safeguards to prevent discrimination through the use of algorithms and AI, and establishing data governance mechanisms to provide oversight over automated systems and AI. We've been consulting and engaging with a number of different stakeholders within and outside the city, including the Accessibility Advisory Committee, Confronting Anti-Black Racism Advisory Committee, the Indigenous Affairs Office, and the Equity Office. And we're continuing to reach out to different groups to provide presentations on the draft DIP. Just to understand where we're at on this timeline, we've been doing this work since December 2019, and then we're now at the stage. If you can see this graphic, then the star denotes where we're at. It's fall of 2021. We're carrying out consultations, and we'll be putting forward a report based on feedback by the end of 2021 to be presented to Council in January 2022. And so we're hoping to, get input quickly and in advance of finalizing this. And the two kinds of engagement that we have upcoming, or actually I should say three. The sessions are the public consultation sessions. We have one taking place tomorrow evening from 6 to 8 p.m. And then another one on Wednesday from 3 to 5 p.m. And those will be longer sessions, so there will be a more in-depth opportunity for people to learn about the DIP principles and provide input. And then we're also hosting drop-in sessions, recognizing that not everyone might have the time to really provide input during the public consultation sessions. So my colleague Hamish and I will be setting aside 3 slots of time in the weeks to come where we can speak to principles specifically. So if you want to speak about privacy and security, come speak to us Monday, 3:30 to 5 p.m. They'll be online on WebEx working on the DIP, and we're happy to talk to anyone about those. And in addition, the draft DIP is going to be available on the State of Toronto website for anyone to download and review. And we're using an online tool called Itello, which is a public engagement platform where people can review it. They can vote on what they like or dislike as well. All of that will go online tomorrow. So, yeah, it's an exciting time for the city. And so the questions that we wanted to ask and get your input on are: how can we build on these policy statements to ensure that issues of equity, bias, and discrimination are appropriately addressed? what elements do we need to consider as we develop a digital equity policy? And are there any key groups or stakeholders that we should be meeting as we carry out these public consultations? We're entirely open to feedback. So I'll pause there, but I'll leave this slide up for now.
Nabil, thank you very much, and thank you to you and Allison and the team for the presentation. If I can just, yes, thank you so much. Folks, you do have the presentation on the city's portal, so it's on the link. If there are any questions of the staff presentations, that would be helpful right now. Because the staff have specifically asked you for feedback, if you want to roll your questions and comments into one section, we could probably do it that way, just in the interest of time management. If I can just see indication from members who are interested in asking questions or perhaps providing comments. Leslie, starting with Leslie. Laura, anyone else? Okay, Leslie first, then Laura.
I found the unmute button. So it's Leslie, and thank you for the presentation. I just want to let you know there's an organization called ODLAN, Ontario Digital Literacy Access Network, and it was set up at the beginning of COVID, and it's to help queer seniors, and now we're including anybody who is queer, but the focus is on queer seniors, to connect digitally in terms of socializing, because so many queer seniors went back into the closet during COVID, and we are wanting queer seniors to connect. This ODLAN is the first queer digital literacy access network in Canada, and it is imperative that you consult with this organization. And I can give the information to Janice or whoever I'm supposed to give it to.
Leslie, thank you very much. I think if you do pass along to Janice, Janice will make sure that Alice, Nabil, and Hamish get it from her. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura. Go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to string this together, and I'm not 100% sure if it's going to be super articulate, but I'm going to try. So something I would consider in digital infrastructure is addressing some of the issues that communities are facing because of other things we've heard about today, like poverty and homelessness. So there's a decentralization of physical presence. So in the past, for instance, we would flock to somewhere like the village and live close to each other for safety. I know that something I value out of the community is people actually telling me, like, it's not safe to go here at this time. It's not safe for us to be here at this time. And so thinking about that decentralization, what are services you can provide to remove some of these barriers? My initial thought was something like a safety report where you could just report like an instance of homophobia, instance of racism that would pop up on a map and help people see things. But when I was thinking of that, I was also thinking that if you do something along those lines, being very careful about, and you mentioned collecting people's data of like who they are, identification, that sort of thing, of if the service you're providing is community focused, that it's not city focused. So in an instance like that, where you're collecting instances of maybe large, small, all of the instances of homophobia to create a map for community, that's for community. And so that shouldn't need a person to identify themselves and contact the police and that sort of thing to make them feel safer. So just in terms of collecting data, being like, is this for the community or is this for us? And do we really need that data? It will make communities that have been marginalized feel safer if they know they're not being surveilled. And there isn't a way of being surveilled because we've been surveilled all our lives. So just a way to make us feel safer is making sure that it's very clear what data you're collecting. but also addressing some of the community needs and creating the infrastructure for that.
Thank you very much, Laura. Anyone else? Okay. I don't see any other Oh, Burka, I see your hand. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
I'll just name them so they're like specifically there, but these might already be on your radar of like as you move through some of these pieces. I'm always thinking about trans communities and relationships to identities, relationships to legal identities, all those pieces. So just like a lot of digital infrastructure often leans on like IDs, face recognition tools, all of these pieces, and they fall apart for many communities. And so how that's being considered. Access piece, I think you've talked about a lot, and it's very clear that you're considering it of just like digital literacy pieces, but also like still in a time period where there needs to be options to opt out. And so what does that look like when you have automated buses playing? I'm sure you're considering all of those things. And then the other consideration that comes in, again, because of the like lack of trust in cybersecurity and data collection, is just a lot of the activities that to us LGBTQ communities may be engaged in or may be adjacent to are criminalized still in the system in Canada. And so those connections can also feel really complicated. I'm not sure if I have a fully thought through like way to express this, but hopefully that's making sense. And so it's like also in specific communities and spaces, how is that thought through? Adding to Laura's comment of like the pieces of like that, those are such great comments, Laura, around how we used to like know where to safety and how to make safety happen. And also just like that data can't come from the police. And so it's also like the complexities, or if it comes through the police, what does that look like? Those complexities are really real. Because also then that also creates policing. Like if that data is collected in a certain way, like it's not being policed then. And so just some things going through my mind.
Thank you very much, Burka. Anyone else? Terrence, go ahead, please.
Just a quick question. So access to tech came up in my mind. Again, I also defer to just experiences I have in Rexdale, and a lot of the youth in my program had problems this year during COVID because one, primarily poverty, not having access. But then two, if they did have access, there was a lot of parental oversight with that access. And many, if not, most of the youth are not out to family. And so they weren't able to even say access websites because parents were watching their history or, just over their shoulders. What are you doing on the computer? Or even removing technology if they don't agree with what they're looking at for access to information and resources. So anything that we're doing in regards to that when it comes to equity.
Great, thank you, Terrence. Burka, I see your hand up. I'm assuming it's a follow-up comment or a question?
Yeah, just missed one note because it comes up for my workplace. Is that also how you're thinking of child protections? Because even LGBT Youth Line site has found itself against firewalls in school systems in the past because they see certain content and names. And so again, queer and trans two-spirit community spaces are often put as not child friendly. So in public spaces, how is that managed?
Great. Thank you very much. Anyone else? Final call. Thank you. I'd like to move a motion. The motion is to request the Chief Technology Officer to incorporate the committee's feedback into the work of the Digital Infrastructure Plan. Thank you very much, Alice, to you and the team for coming to our committee today. I think one of the things that I would offer to everyone who's on the call is regarding Wi-Fi access and broadband access. This is something we talk about a lot. There is no digital equity. There will be no equitable access to services or supports from the city unless people can actually get online. This is now even declared as a basic right from the UN subcommittee, and I think that we need to recognize that A digital infrastructure plan will only work and be successful if people can access it and understand it. So comprehensively, I know that you are going out to speak to various community members, and thank you very much for doing that. But even as you do that work, I know it is very technical, and I do understand that it is already a very high, there's a high threshold to get involved. So any way that you can demystify and make it relevant to people, that would be helpful. And the best way of doing that is to ensure that every resident in the city has access to broadband at some point in time. Students can't do their homework these days without broadband. You can't even enroll in classes. You can't enroll in recreation programs at the city, as you know, and it is very, very expensive, especially in North America and Canada in particular. We have some of the highest telecom charges and fees in the world. So I do want to recognize that we won't be able to bridge the digital divide until there are, number one, devices in the hands of people who don't have them, but also those devices have to be broadband and Wi-Fi enabled. Otherwise, this entire digital infrastructure plan is mute. I know it's going to be very expensive. I recognize the City of Toronto and no municipality has any real purview over telecommunications, and especially regulatory bodies. But I do think that we, as the largest city in Canada, the most important financial city in Canada, and also the child poverty of Canada, need to be able to advance our position strongly to the federal order of government wherever we can. I know that they are paying attention to rural communities and talking about rural access, but rarely have I seen them acknowledge that even inside cities, we have communities and neighborhoods, including TCHC residents, who have struggled to get online. So I know that you folks are aware of that, but I just want to be able to bring it to the forefront in everything that you do. If you can start with an equity lens, just as you've noted in your report and your presentation, I think it's just reinforcing the point over and over again. Otherwise, the digital divide is just going to become greater, and I don't think any of us want to see that. Thank you very much. There's only one motion on the floor. All those in favor of the motion, if you can indicate your support. Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. Committee members, you've been so wonderful. We have 2 more items on the agenda. I'm going to suggest that we take a 10-minute body stretch break, get a snack, get a glass of water break, and then come right back. We are going to need you all for quorum. For those who can't join us, again, please accept our thanks. We will see you in 10 minutes, and I just want to look at my clock to make sure we all know what 10 minutes means. It means 12:44. 12:45, please come back and we'll deal with our last 2 items. Thank you very much, everyone. So welcome back, everybody. We are now moving on to item number 7. And this is new tools for protecting local culture. We do have staff who are here to lead us through a presentation. And I want to just call Elena Bird and Mariana Mota. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Elena Bird. I'm a Policy Development Officer with EDC. My colleague Mariana Mota will be giving this presentation. I will turn it over to Mariana now.
So good afternoon, and thank you, Councillor and the committee, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Mariana Mota. I'm a Policy Development Officer in Economic Development and Culture, and my pronouns are she and her. So can you hear me well? Just confirming.
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay, thank you very much, Councillor. So this presentation is a first step in exploring tangible ways to protect local culture and communities in areas that are meaningful for their sense of identity and that have been facing urban development pressures. The purpose of today's presentation is to share information about the work, about a preliminary report for the next ECDC meeting, and also to consult to seek advice and guidance on the development of a cultural district designation that is meaningful for communities and for Toronto. There are a few important considerations. There is currently no cultural district program in Toronto, and through this work, we aim to develop a program that reflects the unique context of Toronto. We recognize that the entirety of Toronto is indigenous, and we also acknowledge that there are no specific districts that are more or less cultural. Every part of the city is meaningful and important to different communities. And again, through this presentation, we aim to hear your advice and recommendations. They will help inform our next steps and ensure that outcomes of this work are meaningful for 2S LGBTQ+ communities. The presentation will consist of a brief overview of the mandate of the Economic Development and Culture Division, a brief status update on work we've been doing, and some background information regarding Council direction as related to this work, a brief explanation of the existing policy gap this work aims to address, preliminary research and findings, an overview of early engagement and findings, next steps, and discussion questions. The Economic Development and Culture Division, which is leading this work, is responsible for a broad range of activities that are led and implemented out of its 5 sections: business pro services, film and entertainment industries, arts and culture services, museum and heritage services, and program support, which leads marketing, sponsorship, finance, policy development, and research for the division. The goal of the division is to make Toronto a place where business and culture thrive, engaging partners and encouraging Toronto's cultural vibrancy. And I will now share some of the work in Church and Wellesley and on 2S LGBTQ+ communities. There will be increased attention to the community and more work to come. So very briefly, as a first update, Show Love TO, a hyper-local tourism campaign to support the city's economic and cultural recovery, relaunched this past week. There are a number of activities that are part of Show Love TO taking place across Toronto, including in Church and Wellesley, one of them being a Red Heart installation right beside the 519, which you can see here on the screen. Stroll TO, another program to encourage residents to get to know Toronto better, provides itineraries highlighting points of interest in neighborhoods. One of them is specific to the Churchill area and includes points like Glad Day Bookshop, which you see here on the screen, and Barbara Hall Park. Another update is that there have been 5 public consultations on the Streetscape Master Plan for the Church Wellesley BIA to date. The project is led by the Church Wellesley BIA with support from the BIA office in the Economic Development and Culture Division. And the Streetscape Master Plan's goal is to create a vision, an aesthetic vision for the area to help transform it into a global destination. The focus is on 3 key moves: corridor-wide elements such as visual identity, new activation, placemaking zones, and laneway interventions so they are more actively used. In the screen, you see just a glimpse of the area. We encourage you to see the full proposed plan on the Church and Wellesley BIA website. And you note that the vision is based on celebrating the area as a community hub, as an area for entertainment, and also as a place to live, learn, and grow. In the presentation to this advisory committee in the last meeting in June, a few next steps were mentioned. You see them in gray boxes in the slide. So this is also a good opportunity to provide updates on them, which are here in blue boxes, right beside the gray ones. The first one was that a community economic development grant would be provided to the Church Wellesley BIA for recovery and rebuild sessions. As an update, the BIA held the first community economic development session this month. There are 8 sessions planned, and they focus on a variety of topics. You can see on the screen the safety infographic that was distributed in the first session. Another next step that was mentioned was that a roundtable on how to support independent live performance venues, including drag bars, would be created. EDC is currently working in partnership with the Toronto Arts Council, and will convene a roundtable now in October. When it comes to a more equitable cultural funding, which was also mentioned as a next step, EDC is working on a new festivals program, which will provide a clear process and program guidelines to be included in a report to ECDC next month. And finally, in the June presentation, it was mentioned that EDC would explore long-term meaningful options to protect US LGBTQ+ small businesses and cultural spaces in the Church Wellesley Village. And this is the focus of the presentation today. We are currently exploring the feasibility and potential impacts that creating a cultural district designation program may bring for Toronto. So now moving from updates and focusing on a cultural district program, the reason why we are working on this is that in early 2020, there was a motion by Councillor Wong Tam that indicated the need to protect US LGBTQ+ small businesses and cultural spaces. Later in 2020, Council approved a motion on supporting Black businesses and preserving the cultural heritage of Little Jamaica. More recently, a motion directed EDC to identify ways to protect Chinatown's cultural identity. And in July, there was a motion on exploring how to best support the cultural assets and potential of Gary Avenue as a creative community hub. The 4 motions emphasize geographic areas as meaningful hubs for communities in Toronto and for Toronto in general. Here you see images of Church Wellesley, Chinatown, Little Jamaica, and Gary Avenue. And they all highlight issues related to protecting businesses, promoting tourism, protecting culture and heritage, and also to ensuring that there is a sense of community. There are some common themes that indicate the need for a coordinated approach to address displacement through community ownership to ensure that spaces promote a sense of belonging and that they also celebrate communities and celebrate the history of neighborhoods beyond built forms. So to explore what that coordinated approach could look like, we worked on a jurisdictional review with the goal of knowing how other cities have responded to similar challenges. And we also led some early engagement with communities to understand key considerations and ensure that the work reflects the context of Toronto. Through research, it was possible to see that cultural districts are widely used. You see here images of Boston, of the Castro LGBT Cultural District in San Francisco, Singapore, Minneapolis, and Sydney, Australia. There are many cultural districts and over 300 in the United States alone. So upon an initial scan, in-depth research was undertaken for 9 cities, selected based on having an officially recognized cultural district program, and also considering factors like population, density, and diversity. Among them, San Francisco. In the slide here, you see an image used by the African American Cultural District in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, Seattle, and others. Among research findings, it was noted that intangible cultural heritage has been a factor in selecting areas to become cultural districts in a formalized way, that some cities have been proactive in leveraging cultural districts to protect LGBT and BIPOC communities. You see here an image of Compton's Transgender Cultural District in San Francisco, that community engagement has been a key factor, and that as policy tools, the most common ones have been the establishment of a cultural fund to increase access to arts and culture, and supports towards programming that celebrate the identity and the character of the area. We are also looking at some other policy tools that are not specific to cultural districts in other cities, but that may help advance the motions that are driving this work, like the Legacy Business Program in San Francisco. In terms of early engagement, we have consulted over 60 community members, and they included Chinatown and the Church Wellesley BIAs, Pride Toronto, the 519, Friends of Kensington Market, the Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce, and others. And what we heard, among other important points, is that it's very, very important to recognize the history behind some geographic areas being meaningful for communities, which has involved factors like safety. It's also important to ensure that government support is not limited to districts, but to support the areas as meaningful community anchors nonetheless. Acknowledging and targeting the root causes of displacement like affordability and community ownership have also been mentioned in consultations. And the last point here is that the cultural district designation or program should be seen as a place-making methodology, and that it is up to the community to lead. As of today, there is no coordinated approach that does that in Toronto, and that's why, to address this gap, a cultural district designation program is being explored. It would be a combination of tools to protect businesses, cultural spaces, and intangible cultural heritage. And not only would it address common themes identified in motions and consultations, but it would ensure effective use of resources because it would create a process instead of a series of one-offs. It's supported by best practices and research findings, and also informed by early engagement. So where are we at? We are currently in phase 1, which is preliminary work. And we are now we're finalizing a preliminary report recommending that a cultural district program or designation be created for Toronto by identifying the tools to address the considerations we have identified in the first phase. And once the first phase is completed, we expect to start the second phase of this work and develop final recommendations based on engagement with the broader community. So today, we would really appreciate to hear your advice and your recommendations, which will help inform our next steps. There are 2 questions we are particularly interested in. The first one being, what should be considered for the designation to be meaningful for communities and specifically for 2S LGBTQ+ communities? And the second one is what you see as the most important next steps for us to take when it comes to public engagement to help inform this work. So thank you all for listening, and I will now stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and to our committee members. If there are members who with questions to seek clarification from the presentation, I welcome that at this time, or we can go right into the feedback session at your discretion. If I can see some indication with hands up, I'll start to build a speakers list. Okay, seeing none, if you are moved to ask questions afterwards, please let me know. I've just got a few of them for staff myself, and maybe this can start our dialogue. Staff, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just curious to know, with respect to the timeline, recognizing that there's been significant interest, I think, from City Council now, not just on preserving cultural districts, but also about cultural spaces. I think that's really what we're getting to the driving force about, because it's the physical spaces upon where people congregate and where culture is taking place, where it's created. Can you give us a hint on what your thinkings are? Because you've itemized a series of potential avenues that you could explore, but I think from my conversations with business members and owners and operators of the businesses, they don't own the real estate, but they own the business itself. What type of investments, what type of resources could you share with us your thinking and strategy on where you're heading? Because we're talking about taking public dollars and probably investing them into private for-business enterprise whose purpose is to produce space and cultural opportunities for community members to come together. How do we gel that together?
So thank you for the question, Councillor. That's an excellent question. And at this time, what we're doing is focusing on really taking a look at what other cities have been doing in terms of cultural districts when it comes to those two challenges. And in terms of good practices that we've seen when it comes to that, is really about establishing the cultural fund, as I mentioned, but also policy tools that can help with community ownership of the businesses and retail and etc. And types of supports that we've seen in other cities are things like rent control or grants. Of course, those are just examples from other cities that we still need to assess, see the benefits for Toronto, and also see the feasibility, because legislation in Toronto is just very different from other cities we have been looking at. Elena, is there anything you would add to this?
I think the Cultural District program, as Council supports it, is an opportunity to structure city resources more effectively. So there are ways for us to direct our support specifically to helping enliven cultural spaces and protect cultural spaces through this program. Part of phase 2 will be public consultation more broadly to really delve into the program design. And that's where we're going to get into those specific policy tools. We're looking at everything that's currently available and potentially looking at new ways of doing things so that we can make the Cultural District program a robust way for protecting cultural spaces in communities and supporting the protection and also the future vibrancy of cultural districts.
Elena and Mariana, thank you. I have a follow-up question. Queer life and queer culture has oftentimes centered around evening activity. So the nighttime economy, whether it's concert halls or drag shows, dance spaces and clubs, and what I think I want to offer is that Church Street and gay businesses in particular, especially the ones that create cultural spaces where the social interaction and mingling take place, it seems to be stratified between daytime business and nighttime business. So I think there has to be a very specific strategy on how queer businesses are supported so that they can be contributors to the nighttime economy. So I'm just curious to know, because the City of Toronto does have a nighttime economy, we've got a strategy, we've got a night mayor, Councillor Thompson. Is there more that can be done to support LGBT nightlife in particular? Because the village changes over day and night, and I'm just really curious to know if you would be, thinking about and supporting recommendations to council that could provide easier access to those licensing of spaces. How do you ensure people that are safe? How do you build the infrastructure in the evening time to support the nighttime activities? Those type of things I think would be interesting. And the other thing, of course, is to eliminate over-regulation. I think it's important that we don't over-regulate these spaces. So therefore, perhaps I know it's hard because we don't direct the police or we don't direct bylaw enforcement, but we certainly need probably less of that in the evening time for people to come out and feel safe.
Thanks for your comments, Councillor. And that's something that is very interesting that we heard from stakeholders as well when consulting with them, that it was extremely important to pay attention to the night life of Church Wellesley and also to the daytime. So it could be really a comprehensive approach to the area. And I'm sure that Elena can add some comments because she's extremely familiar with the nighttime economy work. But the other thing that I wanted to add to that is just reiterate that EDC, in partnership with the Toronto Arts Council, is now convening a roundtable with stakeholders now in October, just to try to have a better understanding of what needs to be done in terms of the permits and etc. to really support the live performance venues.
Yes, thank you for that excellent question. And I think that one of the things that this really speaks to is the idea of the 24-hour economy and the 24-hour cultural district. So there's so much learning that's already happened through our nightlife action plan and through, we both have an internal night economy working group and an external working group. So there's a great opportunity to build on this work. And I think, though, there's probably made in Church Wellesley solutions that can come out of these conversations around a potential cultural district for the area, particularly around how do we ensure an intersectional and inclusive nightlife for the village. And I'm really excited to work with this committee and to work with community on envisioning what a 24-hour economy looks like for 2S LGBTQ spaces in our city.
Thank you both. My time is up. Susan, did I see your hand go up? Okay, go ahead, please. And Laurie. Susan, then Laurie. Oh, sorry, Laura.
Just being mindful of time, but just a little bit of feedback. Talking about the 24-hour economy. Well, just thinking historically, there's two things on my mind. Maybe that's Kruggo. Sorry, too much WebEx this morning. Thank you for your presentation. I was able to review this earlier. So we have a historical context where people gathered in certain hidden populations in bars without being out. So that's one part of our culture, and like a bar in a day. And then I'm thinking, I'm just thinking how I'm building on the councillor's comments, the chair's comments around there's a daytime sort of, there's a social interaction, and completely different on the weekends and evenings, especially on the weekends. They're from a tourist economy. So thinking a lot about those things, but as we've gone from a criminalized and targeted community to one that now has the legal rights to have families and children's, are the best places the bars to bring our children to. And I say that a little tongue in cheek. So we need to create, I think it's really important that we create alternate types of milieus for people to gather in public parks, and so that just thinking of all of that, I'm not getting the words out as clearly as I did on the previous agenda items, but also the concentration because of criminalization in a particular block or two of Toronto, and that block moving around to different, over the decades to different, and sort of lodged in the Church Wellesley neighborhood. But we have people from across the city who are included in our 2+, 2S LGBTQ plus communities, and how that's really important too. And there's these hidden components of where people have gathered, but not in our central region. So it's just some off the top of the head feedback on things to consider moving forward on a cultural specific designation. Thank you. And thank you for your report.
Thank you, Susan. Laura?
Hi. In my teachings, elders and youth are considered to fly closer to the creator. And so I think that oftentimes we remember to include elders in consultation, but we don't have meaningful consultation with youth. And placemaking, it's really, really important to include meaningful consultation of youth. And what that means is more than two. Like, there should be more than two youth involved, and a diverse section of youth. So that's my one comment. My other comment, and I think it's been slightly touched on, but I want to really exaggerate the note of the intersectionality. We've been seeing across North America, women identifying in women's spaces, women queer spaces closing down, and there not being any of those anymore. And so it's not enough in this case to support, sorry, my dog's going nuts in the background, to just support 2S LGBT culture. I think we need to make sure that we're putting a DEI lens on even that, and prioritize intersectional safe spaces, because other folks will feel safe in those places, but we really need to make sure that the groups that are often left behind, even in the queer community, are centered in this situation as well. So not really questions, but just comments. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Laura. Leslie, and then Terrence.
I just, thanks for your presentation, and just touching on what Laura was saying, just before COVID, so between 2019 and the beginning of 2020, we've had 3 community forums talking about disappearing spaces for queer women. And queer women don't have the money to have queer spaces like men do, and it's primarily white cis men who have the money on Church Street. So it really would be helpful to consider how you can fund spaces for queer women who don't have money.
Thank you, Leslie. Terrence.
I'm just lending my support also because most of you folks already mentioned talking from the youth perspective. So myself actually coming out, 23 years ago, and accessing services downtown, all we had was 519 and no youth spaces, none, which meant we either snuck into the Red Spot, which was a bar that barely carded, or we hung out on the steps of Second Cup, or got some poutine at Bub Subs. And that's assuming you could pay, because I came from a poor family, so I was always mooching off my friends who could afford poutine. Shut down the Second Cup stairs, and then we just hit the parks. Back then, Barber Hall, I can't remember what it's called now, or behind the school with the squeegee kids hanging out. There is a lack of space for youth. One of the greatest things back in my generation that UFT did was called the Homo Hop, which was a dance, a social dance, all ages, no alcohol. That stopped. So looking at it more than just, 1 or 2 programs out of the 519 or C2IS or SWORD, a regular, consistent program, space, whatever, where we can keep the youth engaged is big. I brought my youth downtown for a tour of the village because they've never seen the village because they're from Rexdale, showing resources, programs, sports. And the thing they asked me was, so where do I go? Well, you can go to the 519. Yeah, but I can't come here all the time. Where do I go to hang out? Where do I go if, I want to socialize with other people? I'm like, maybe at the park. I don't know. That's a big problem. And the youth are our future.
Thank you, Terrence. Anyone else? Final comments? Okay. Seeing none, I'd like to move a motion, please. And the motion is to request the Interim General Manager of Economic Development and Culture to incorporate the committee's feedback into the development of the Cultural District Plan for the City of Toronto. And I want to thank staff for your work. I recognize that we got a sneak peek of your presentation at our last meeting, so thank you very much for doing that. I see that you've actually further refined it since our first discussion, and I really do appreciate that. I also recognize that some of the refinements have incorporated feedback that you would have heard through the summertime in the presentations, and I think that was incredibly helpful. What I want to offer you is just a couple of quick thoughts. Obviously, there is the business side of cultural space making, and that is critically important because we know that those spaces are oftentimes left to the private sector, and we want to be able to support those because they're important to all of us. And I think you heard from the committee last time is that we want that city to think about what happens in the village, but also what happens outside the village. Not everyone's able to live close by, nor can they always come downtown. So I want to just sort of highlight that once again, but also to suggest that there should be some further evaluation on city-owned and operated spaces, city-funded organizations and agencies that receive a lot of government funding, and perhaps it's time to lean on those partners that there should be some conditions attached to the funding. If you're going to be receiving funding and supports from the City of Toronto, we expect you to make sure your doors are open to everyone, including the creation and carve-out of city city-funded and city-endorsed space for the LGBT community. And I think this comment could probably apply to everything that the city does, whether it's the provision of housing or shelters. It shouldn't be left on this committee or this population to try to carve out 1 or 2 shelters within the shelter system or 1 or 2 units within a housing building for LGBT people. We should be able to go and be where we can and be who we are safely. And I do recognize that we have libraries, we've got community centers, there are youth programming, there's seniors programming, there's obviously the talk about even facilities within long-term care homes. And why is it that it always has to be left on this committee's shoulders or the community's shoulders to demand more space? It should be integrated, and I think that it would be immensely helpful if there was a demonstration from city staff, and especially in this report, on how to go beyond the brick and mortar of the village. It is important. I represent the village. I love the village, but I do remember a time, I'm probably dating myself, and I think largely to Terrence's comment, you talked about the homo hop. I remember a time when the Gay Community Dance Committee was around, and largely it was just, yes, Susan, I see you, and Leslie, you know the space too. It was largely just community members working really hard to carve out community dance space where we can. Volunteers from different nonprofit organizations came out to provide the staffing and the resources to run those dance facilities, and the money driving and going back to community organizations. I know that we cannot ask the city to organize grassroots ad hoc spaces for us like that, but we should be able to use our purchasing dollars and our investments when we work with city partners to ask them specifically, what are you doing to provide LGBT access to your space and services? And if we put a cultural lens over that, it really, I believe, can help us shift the conversation at large. So I just want to say thank you to the staff. I know that you've got a good body of work. And I also just want to recognize that cultural spaces and cultural districts around the world, this is an emerging theme and conversation as we're seeing the ratification of spaces belonging to minority groups, not just sexual minority groups, but just minority groups who are not in the prevalent dominant culture. And so I recognize that this is a new body of thinking where you have to build technical tools, government instruments to protect those spaces. And I do understand that this is a whole new field that we're walking into. But the challenge here for the city is we've got probably the most amazing, dynamic, eclectic, and resilient LGBT community in Canada, North America. If we can't do it here, I don't know where we can. So thank you very much for all that you do. There is any questions of the mover? Okay, we have one motion on the floor. All those in favor indicate your support. Any opposed? That carries. You folks are amazing. Thank you, staff. There's one last item. I'm sorry to delay and prolong this meeting, but forgive me, I didn't get the letter on the agenda earlier, but I got it on now. This last item is entitled Funding Cuts to ACT, AIDS Committee of Toronto, and other health service providers. For those who work in health services, we have, I'm not telling you anything that you don't know, but the AIDS Committee of Toronto did bring to our attention, my office, and others, the attention that they are losing about $216,000 in 2022 starting as of April. Apparently, the Public Health Agency of Canada is reducing funding for HIV/AIDS organizations. ACT has just hosted its last AIDS walk earlier this last 2 weeks ago, and I think that if there is something that this committee could do is to express to Council and make a recommendation to Council that we should stand up and be heard and have our voice logged as a protest. So this is a vote of opposition to the fact that that funding is being cut to critical services when we need it the most, and also to therefore maybe leans in and support the House of Commons and the chambers who have said that the federal government needs to increase funding to HIV/AIDS services by $100 million moving forward. That is the shortfall they've identified. So that is the motion before you. It's a letter, it's a recommendation contained in the letter. Are there any questions of the mover? Anyone to speak? No? Ready to vote? Okay. All those in favor? Lend us your support. Thank you for indicating so. Any opposed? That carries. Okay, fantastic, folks. This has been a very long meeting, but a very constructive one. I want to thank you all for your time and attention, as always. Have a very safe few weeks, and we will see you very shortly. All the commitments that we made to forward links as they become available to staff reports, we will make sure we get them to you. And if there's any questions that you have for myself as chair in between the committee meetings, things that you want to see the committee tackle in the upcoming months, please let me know. I'll be happy to work with you. Take care, everyone, and thank you to our AT staff and to the clerk for the support. Okay, be well. Oh, actually, before you go, there's one other thing. I apologize. The clerk is catching me. We need to move a motion. We need to move a motion to excuse the absentees. Thank you, Burka. So moved. Here comes the motion. Oh, that's not the motion, but sorry, folks. 30 seconds. Here it comes. Okay. The committee is to excuse the absence of Ashante Fry and Monica Forrester from the September 27, 2021 meeting of the committee. This motion was moved by Burka. All those in favor? Any opposed? That carries. Now we can safely say goodbye. Okay. Be well, everyone. Take care.